Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where the ancient world grows quiet for a little while, and old stories settle beside you like soft shadows. Tonight we drift toward a figure who rarely gets the spotlight, yet whose influence threads through the oldest tales of conflict humanity ever tried to understand. You've probably heard of gods who shaped rivers, kings, or destinies, but there was another presence standing behind so many early stories of power and tension. Presence not usually loud, not usually at the centre, yet responsible for one of the most dramatic shifts in the way early people imagined their world. His name was Shara, and he was remembered as the first warrior of the Anunnaki, the one who carried the earliest idea of battle down from the realm of the gods. Before we wander too far, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, and what the evening feels like on your side of the world. Maybe it's late. Maybe the day still hangs around a little. Either way, I'm glad you're here. And if this quiet exploration brings you comfort or helps you settle a bit, a like or a subscribe would mean a great deal. It helps this space find others who might enjoy a slower journey through the stories the past left behind. So, take a breath, ease into wherever you are, and let your mind drift with the older rhythms for a moment. Because Shara's story doesn't begin with a clash or a blade. It begins with the way ancient people saw the sky watching them. It begins with the realization that even before humanity learned how to raise walls or shape shields, there were beings in their stories who understood power and preparation long before any mortal picked up a weapon. Imagine early Mesopotamia settling into dusk, when the last sunlight pressed against the horizon and the first stars arrived. For people living thousands of years ago, each star held a memory, a pattern, a presence. The sky wasn't empty to them. It was a realm of order and hierarchy, filled with divine figures whose decisions influenced what happened on Earth. In that world, the Anunnaki were not distant. They were woven into the framework of how everything worked. They oversaw cities, judged disputes, shaped floods, and maintained the fragile balance between humans and the forces they couldn't control. Yet even among that impressive assembly, Shara occupied a distinct place. He wasn't described with the same grandeur as Enlil or the same cunning reputation as Enki. His story was quieter, tucked between lines on tablets and in hymns that shifted over time. Still, his presence mattered, because he represented something new. People had always feared storms, illness, famine, or the moods of the gods, but the idea of organized conflict, of deliberate confrontation shaped as an art, was different. That idea needed a figure to embody it, and Shara became the one who carried that early image of a warrior. If you picture the earlier settlements growing along the Euphrates or Tigris, there must have been moments when people watched strangers approach across the fields and felt uncertain about what they were seeing. Life was fragile, and cooperation didn't always come easily. Some groups clashed over land or water, sometimes out of need, sometimes out of misunderstanding. Over generations, those tensions gathered shape. They became stories, warnings, rituals. When the first imaginations tried to explain why conflict existed at all, their eyes turned upward. Not because they blamed the sky, but because they believed the sky held the blueprint for everything that happened below. This is where Shara quietly stepped in. He was not a chaotic bringer of destruction. His role wasn't to revel in violence. He symbolized preparation, readiness, obedience to higher command. In many ways, he embodied the early understanding that conflict was not random. It had rules, causes, patterns. The people who told his stories saw him as a guide, not an instigator. And yet, as time passed, the association between Shara and the introduction of war to humanity became more pronounced. It didn't mean he forced humans into conflict. Instead, he represented the divine version of something humans would soon learn to mirror. When we follow the threads of his presence, they lead through cities like Umar, where he was honoured as a patron. His connection to Inanna, one of the most powerful goddesses in Mesopotamian mythology, gave him a complex position in the divine hierarchy. He wasn't a solitary force, but a child shaped by the expectations of powerful figures around him. The old hymns describe him as noble, brave, and destined to stand at the front of divine armies. Even as a youth, he is portrayed as ready to guard or defend the sacred realms. These qualities made him an emblem of a type of strength that was admired yet feared. Ancient Mesopotamians lived in a world where life required cooperation, but also readiness. Floods could ruin fields, neighbouring settlements might compete for resources, and shifting alliances among city-states made the political landscape unpredictable. Against that backdrop, the idea of a divine warrior didn't feel violent, it felt protective, a necessary presence in a world full of change. Shara represented the controlled, purposeful form of conflict that helped society survive. When people prayed to him, they weren't asking for chaos. They were asking for steadiness, courage, and a sense of order during uncertain times. The more we look at how ancient people constructed their pantheon, the clearer it becomes that every god filled a distinct role. Shara's role answered a question humanity hadn't yet fully formed. It wasn't simply, why do wars happen, but what is the difference between aggression and defense? What does it mean to stand ready without seeking destruction? The stories tied to him reflect those nuances. They show a god who symbolizes responsibility as much as force. People today might imagine warrior gods as loud, commanding figures whose presence shakes mountains or sends thunder rolling across valleys. Shara's mythology works differently. His image is steady, disciplined, almost formal. This wasn't the wild frenzy of battle, but the preparation before battle exists at all. A sword polished at dawn, a shield lifted into first light, a quiet oath taken in the presence of other gods. These were symbols that early storytellers used to describe him. When you think about ancient societies trying to define themselves, the relevance becomes clearer. A community becomes stronger when it understands how to protect itself, but also how to direct its strength. Many early Mesopotamian myths were not simply tales of divine power, but reflections of what those societies were learning about themselves. As city-states grew and competed, the need for structured defense increased. Temples and walls were built not just for worship or shelter, but for identity. Shara became a figure that embodied the discipline behind those developments. His presence also signalled a shift in how people perceive the divine. Earlier deities were often tied to natural forces like fertility, storms, rivers, or the underworld. But a warrior god spoke to human creation, conflict shaped by intention, planning, and hierarchy. War was not a natural phenomenon like a flood. It was a human one, and yet myth placed it in the hands of the gods first. It allowed humans to look at their own actions from a distance, through symbolic stories that helped them understand complexity. As generations passed, Shara's name appeared in inscriptions, prayers, and ceremonial lists. He never became as famous as some of his divine relatives, but his role remained steady. He guided kings, lent symbolic strength to armies, and offered a sense of divine order to those preparing for danger. His temples, though not as large as others, held significance for communities that honoured him. They stood as reminders that readiness was a form of wisdom, not aggression. In the rhythm of daily life, people might have turned to him when sending men to guard a boundary, or when negotiating peace after a dispute. Warriors carried symbols tied to him into battle, not because they sought violence, but because they hoped for protection and clarity. His presence was meant to prevent chaos, to turn conflict into something structured enough to survive. Even those who feared the consequences of war found comfort in knowing there was a divine figure associated with discipline and restraint. The tablets that reference him are often fragmentary, but they point to a consistent identity. He was known for loyalty, for a kind of noble readiness, and for embodying the idea that power must be guided. These are qualities that resonated deeply with early leaders. A city without discipline could fall easily. A king without guidance could make dangerous choices. Shara represented the equilibrium between strength and responsibility. When you let your mind drift through those distant centuries, it becomes easier to imagine the atmosphere in which his mythology formed. Fires softening the darkness in early cities, scribes etching symbols into clay while priests recited hymns, farmers sharpening tools that served for work but could be used for defence if needed, young men practising with spears not out of desire for combat, but because their elders knew that protection was essential. In those moments, a warrior god wasn't a symbol of destruction. He was a guardian of the community's stability. The story of Shara also reveals something about the evolution of human thinking. As societies grew more complex, their gods reflected that complexity. The earliest hunter-gatherers needed deities tied to weather or fertility. Early farmers needed gods who oversaw crops and rivers, but the first cities needed gods who understood politics, justice, and defence. Shara stands at the intersection of that development. His mythology captures a moment when human life required new forms of strength. His narrative doesn't glorify violence. Instead, it acknowledges that conflict becomes inevitable once societies expand. Yet even in these old stories, there's a sense that Shara was conscious of the weight he carried. The depictions of him throughout the centuries often reveal a quiet dignity. Not triumph, not destruction, but measured control. It suggests that early people didn't want a chaotic god of war. They wanted someone who kept conflict from overwhelming them. Someone who held the line, literally and symbolically. That desire, reflected through thousands of years of storytelling, shows how humans saw war not as something glorious, but as something that needed to be handled carefully. As this quieter beginning settles around us, the path ahead grows clearer. There is more to understand about where Shara came from, how he developed his earliest traits, and why ancient civilizations placed him at the threshold between divine order and human conflict. His presence in myths doesn't shout, it stays steady. That steadiness shaped how cultures imagined the work of warriors, the meaning of strength, and the first spark of battle long before it was ever fought in the human world. When trying to trace the earliest moments of Shara's story, the pieces rarely line up neatly. They appear as fragments scattered across clay tablets, temple hymns, ceremonial inscriptions, and passing references tucked inside larger myths. Yet, even with their scattered nature, they reveal something unmistakable about him. Before he ever held a weapon in any story, before humans ever carved the first representations of soldiers on stone, Shara existed as a figure taking shape in a world still learning how to understand conflict. He was already present long before battles grew into the structured events later civilizations came to recognize. He walked through a time when even the gods had not yet settled into the roles they would ultimately play. In the oldest layers of Mesopotamian mythology, the Anunnaki were not presented as a rigid hierarchy at first. Their roles shifted as cities rose and fell, as political landscapes changed, and as new cult centers gained influence. Against this shifting background, Shara emerged gradually. He didn't arrive with a clear outline that later warrior gods would possess. His earliest identity formed slowly, his attributes accumulating as people found ways to describe concepts they had barely begun to understand. The earliest storytellers did not give him a sword and declare him the god of war. Instead, they shaped him in subtler strokes, placing him in scenes where discipline mattered, where readiness mattered, where responsibility mattered even before outright conflict was part of the story. This early stage of his portrayal reveals a world already wrestling with ideas of protection and danger. The first permanent settlements in Mesopotamia were beginning to change daily life. People who once wandered seasonally were now anchored to fields that needed tending. Villages expanded, irrigation channels required maintenance, and harvests shaped the rhythm of entire communities. With this stability came something new, the awareness that these settled places could be threatened. Early people realized that the crops they had worked so hard to grow could be taken, burned, or spoiled by outsiders. That awareness reshaped their stories. They needed figures who understood the burden of protecting a community, and Shara stepped quietly into that psychological space. His earliest associations weren't with destruction, but with preservation. The tablets that reference him, especially those connected to the city of describe a figure who stands ready in the service of powerful deities. These texts often place him in supportive roles rather than solitary ones, which suggests that at first he wasn't imagined as the aggressive bringer of battle. Instead, he represented the organised effort required to prevent harm. The idea of ordering forces, managing tensions, or preparing defences all belonged to a realm not yet called war. This was a proto-form of conflict, a stage before battles had recognisable shape. Shara became the embodiment of that early responsibility. As more structured societies formed, the gods began reflecting the increasing complexity of human life. Deities who once embodied general forces of nature began acquiring specialised roles. Scribes assigned them duties, storytellers gave them motivations, and priests wove them into rituals. Through all this, Shara evolved. At first, his identity was tied to protection under the authority of Inanna, who herself held domains far beyond her later associations with love and conflict. In these older stories, Shara appears as a child under her guidance, a youthful figure shaped by the expectations placed on him. Even in this early stage, he carried the seeds of discipline that would later define him. The symbolic role of a divine youth undergoing preparation resonated with the society that created these stories. Young men in those early cities were often trained not for constant warfare, but for the role of guardians. The training required strength, order, and obedience. These traits became embedded in Shara's identity long before he took on the mantle of a warrior. He represented the transition from innocence to responsibility, a path familiar to many who left behind childhood, as communities demanded more of them. His earliest role mirrored the progression humans experienced themselves. The temples that honoured him did not initially emphasise combat. Many of the inscriptions hint at ceremonies meant to instill discipline and loyalty. In that way, Shara's worship became a way for communities to shape their values. What mattered wasn't the act of fighting, but the act of being ready to defend. Because life in early Mesopotamia was unpredictable, people needed reassurance that someone, whether mortal or divine, held the responsibility of vigilance. Shara became a symbol for that vigilance. His readiness was not portrayed as aggression, but as a calm and steady stance, an assurance that danger could be met with order. The early myths give the sense that Shara learned his identity gradually. He was a child of high divine lineage, but his importance didn't stem from power alone. He needed to grow into a world where divine roles were becoming more defined. His presence reinforced the idea of preparation long before preparation became necessary. These stories implied that even the gods had to learn the structure of their duties. Just as humans developed tools and built walls, the gods developed aspects of themselves that answered the growing needs of their followers. What stands out when following the earliest traces of Shara is the absence of chaotic violence. He was not a destroyer. His early existence wasn't about unleashing fear. He represented something organised and purposeful. Even in the tablets where he's described as standing at the front of a divine assembly ready to guard, there is no sense of bloodlust. Instead, his stance feels almost ceremonial. The first storytellers didn't attribute rage or frenzy to him. They imagined a god who embodied resolve, one who could respond to conflict without becoming consumed by it. To understand these early footsteps, it helps to imagine the context of those who created the stories. Writing was still developing. Myths were passed orally, preserved by priests and scribes who shaped them with every retelling. The geography itself influenced the narratives. Rivers shifted course, seasons changed violently, and neighbouring settlements often competed for resources. These environmental pressures built an unspoken tension into daily life. People needed reassurance that the divine world mirrored their own struggles, that the gods also faced decisions about order, control, and readiness. Shara provided that reassurance. His early footsteps appeared not on battlefields, but in quiet scenes of preparation. The development of warfare in human societies was gradual. At first, conflict involved small skirmishes or disputes over land or water rights. These events rarely resembled the structured battles of later periods. They were personal, local, and often unpredictable. When people looked for divine explanations, they did not imagine a god who enjoyed conflict. They imagined one who understood the cost of conflict. Shara, with his association to loyalty and discipline, became the one who carried those early understandings. His role did not justify violence. It explained why society started to prepare for circumstances where strength needed to be shown. As more city-states rose in the region and competed for influence, the idea of conflict gained more shape in mythology. Shara grew in parallel with that evolution. Over time, his responsibilities expanded. He became more firmly tied to the concept of divine armies, though not in an aggressive way. His presence implied structure rather than chaos. Divine armies in these myths did not appear as wild forces running uncontrolled through the world. They acted with precision, control, and purpose. In many ways, Shara represented the training ground before such armies could even exist. An important aspect of his identity is how often he appears beside other deities, rather than acting independently. This feature suggests that he wasn't meant to be a free agent of destruction. He was part of a collective effort to maintain order. Early myths often highlight his loyalty to the deities he served, especially Inanna. Loyalty, obedience, and discipline are themes threaded throughout the references to him. These themes reflect the values ancient communities needed to survive. Before anyone sharpened a blade for battle, they sharpened their understanding of unity. Shara stood at the centre of that understanding. It becomes clear that Shara's early role was built around this central idea of contributing to a greater structure. A warrior in these early stories was not merely someone who fought. A warrior was someone who carried responsibility on behalf of the community. By embodying that responsibility, Shara helped early Mesopotamians articulate their fears and hopes. They lived in a landscape where danger could emerge without warning, where one bad season could lead to desperation, where neighbouring groups might become rivals. They needed a figure who could represent the readiness to face those uncertainties without losing control. The concept of preparation itself became sacred. Rituals focused on readiness were not about summoning violence. They were about acknowledging the possibility of disruption and creating stability through discipline. Shara's presence in those rituals strengthened that mindset. A community that honoured him was a community that emphasised foresight. They were not waiting for danger passively. They were acknowledging that their survival depended on the balance between caution and strength. Young men in those cities, especially those being trained to defend their communities, often carried symbols tied to Shara. These symbols were simple at first, not elaborate or artistic. They represented the transition into adulthood, a recognition that they were stepping into roles with weight and responsibility. The rituals connected to Shara likely mark these transitions, shaping his influence long before battle became a formal part of life. His identity became deeply tied to this idea of a young warrior stepping into duty. Over time, as writing grew more widespread and political tension increased between city-states like Umma and Lagash, Shara's identity expanded. He became more closely associated with structured conflict. The first documented wars in human history took place in this region. These were not vast battles with thousands of soldiers, but small, organised confrontations over boundaries, water rights, and agricultural land. As these conflicts grew more common, the image of Shara evolved naturally. He became a divine representative of the new reality Mesopotamians were facing. The need to defend one's land, community, and identity now had a symbolic figure attached to it. Even so, the early roots of his identity lingered. He remained a figure of discipline rather than destruction. His footsteps before the age of formal battles capture this transitional moment in human thought. He existed in the space between instinctive defense and organized warfare. That transitional phase shaped not only his identity, but the mythology surrounding him. The people who told these early stories were not celebrating conflict. They were trying to understand it, to give it form, and to find a divine presence who could help them make sense of the tension that accompanied growth. These early footsteps reveal a god emerging from the quiet recognition that life required readiness. They show a figure shaped by the values of stability, discipline, and service. Before battles had names, before swords were crafted for war rather than work, before the idea of armies existed, Shara was already present in the imagination of ancient people. He represented something they understood intuitively, that the world was unpredictable, that strength needed guidance, and that preparation was itself a form of protection. As we move further into his story, these early foundations continue to guide his identity. He did not begin as a god of conflict. He began as a guardian shaped by a community's need to survive a changing world. The transformation from readiness to conflict did not happen suddenly. It grew slowly, shaped by the experiences of those who lived through the earliest tensions of civilization. Shara walked with them through those early uncertainties, becoming the figure who embodied the growing realization that strength, used with discipline, would soon become a defining part of human life. Tracing the birth of Shara means stepping into one of the quieter corners of ancient mythology, a place where ideas formed slowly and identities emerged gradually. Many deities in Mesopotamian lore have origin stories that stretch across generations of storytellers, and Shara is no exception. His birth was not described in lengthy epics or vivid tales carved into stone. Instead, it appeared subtly through scattered references that evolved over centuries. Even so, the fragments that survive reveal a steady image of how he entered the divine world and how he became associated with the qualities that shaped his later reputation. His lineage connected him to figures who carried immense influence in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Shara was identified as a child of Inanna in many traditions, though interpretations varied from region to region. Inanna's presence in mythology changed often, shifting between roles that involved fertility, rulership, justice, and conflict. Her wide influence made her a powerful figure, and any deity associated with her inherited a significant symbolic position. Shara's relationship to her shaped his earliest identity, placing him within a framework that balanced authority, expectation, and potential. The earlier stories tied to his birth didn't focus on spectacle. They didn't dwell on dramatic scenes of thunder echoing across the heavens or cosmic battles erupting at the moment of his arrival. Instead, they described him with a tone that suggested inevitability. He appeared as a child who carried the traits his lineage demanded. His presence carried the weight of preparation and readiness long before those traits were given names. It wasn't unusual in Mesopotamian mythology for young gods to embody ideas that civilizations were just starting to understand. Shara became one of those symbolic beginnings. To understand the origins attributed to him, it helps to consider the cultural environment that shaped his story. Early Mesopotamian societies were beginning to organize themselves with increasing complexity. Cities developed political structures, leaders sought legitimacy through divine association, and temples became central to both religious and administrative life. Against this backdrop, stories about the divine world reflected human concerns. Deities were described as organizational forces, each handling responsibilities that mirrored the structure emerging in early cities. Shara's birth symbolized the arrival of a presence that would later guide the idea of disciplined strength. Although myths rarely described the moment of his birth directly, they often emphasized the qualities he inherited. His connection to Inanna implied a blend of authority and responsibility. His early associations with orderly strength reflected the expectations placed upon him. He was not born into chaos, he was born into purpose. That purpose grew clearer as later stories adapted to changing social conditions. The references to storms, steel, and starlight, that appear in some interpretations of his origins do not represent literal events. They reflect the symbolic environment in which his identity took shape. Storms held deep meaning for ancient Mesopotamians. They could bring life by watering crops or destruction, by overwhelming fields and homes. Many deities represented natural forces, and storms often symbolized power that humans couldn't control. Associating Shara with storms was not meant to tie him to destruction. It tied him to the idea of strength that needed guidance. Storms didn't choose when to arrive. They followed the patterns of the world. Shara's presence reflected the understanding that strength, like weather, required discipline. Steel, though not yet a material widely used during the earliest periods of his worship, symbolized the concept of crafted power. Tools and early weapons were often made from copper, bronze, or stone, but the idea of metal becoming an extension of human effort held strong symbolic meaning. Associating Shara with steel in later traditions expressed the idea that strength was shaped deliberately. It wasn't wild or uncontrolled. It was forged through practice, discipline, and purpose. These ideas matched the way communities saw him. He wasn't a god who brought violence without cause. He symbolized the process through which power gained structure. Starlight held a different symbolic weight. For ancient people, stars represented guidance, order, and continuity. They marked seasons, guided travel, and shaped calendars. Associating Shara with starlight wasn't about placing him in the sky as a constellation. It emphasized the idea that his presence helped communities navigate uncertainty. Just as stars helped travelers understand their direction, Shara guided people through situations where strength needed clarity. His connection to starlight echoed the steady, constant guidance that early societies needed from their gods. The combination of storms, steel, and starlight reflected a balance of natural force, crafted discipline, and divine order. These elements shaped the imagery surrounding his birth. They didn't describe a moment, they described a meaning. Shara's identity was not built from dramatic mythic scenes. It was built from the values that early societies needed to articulate. His birth represented the arrival of a presence meant to influence the way communities understood strength and conflict. When following these early elements, it becomes clear that Shara's birth was not treated as an isolated event. Myths did not pause to describe the moment in detail. Instead, they focused on what his presence meant for the divine world. He was introduced as a figure who would take on responsibilities associated with discipline and protection. His role was shaped from the beginning by the expectations tied to his lineage. His birth placed him within a network of divine figures who influenced the structure of the world. Each deity contributed to maintaining balance. Shara's contribution emerged through the increasing importance of organized strength. The concept of divine birth in Mesopotamian mythology often reflected the natural cycles of life. Deities were born to represent ideas needed by humanity at particular times. When agriculture expanded, fertility gods gained prominence. When cities formed, deities tied to justice, rulership, and boundaries became important. As conflict became structured rather than instinctive, gods associated with organized strength emerged. Shara's birth aligned with this shift. His presence symbolized the growing realization that human societies needed to understand strength, not as chaos, but as something shaped and controlled. Stories emphasizing his youth reinforce this interpretation. He was not depicted as a fully formed warrior. He grew into that identity gradually. The process mirrored the development of early societies. A young god learning discipline reflected communities learning how to prepare for confrontation. His early years symbolized practice, training, and readiness. Rather than portraying him as a sudden bringer of battle, these stories showed him learning the responsibilities tied to strength. His birth marked the beginning of that journey, not its culmination. In many traditions, divine children carried symbolic roles long before they were associated with specific functions. Their stories highlighted qualities that would define them later. Shara's early descriptions emphasized loyalty, courage, and steadiness. These traits matched the emerging need for organized defense in human communities. His birth offered mythic language for people beginning to understand how strength could be used responsibly. He represented the idea that power developed gradually, shaped by guidance and expectation. The temples honoring him reinforced this idea. Rituals associated with Shara often involved gestures of commitment rather than displays of aggression. Early records show offerings that symbolize responsibility rather than conquest. These rituals didn't celebrate battle. They prepared communities for the possibility of danger. The birth of a god tied to readiness became a symbolic foundation for practices focused on maintaining stability. His earliest representations may have shown him carrying weapons, but the context suggested training rather than use. The way scribes wrote about him also reveals something about his origins. They rarely described him acting without direction. Instead, he appeared under the guidance of more established deities. This structure mirrored the organization of early societies, where youth trained under elders and followed orders meant to preserve the community. Shara's early stories reinforced the idea that strength required oversight. His birth placed him in a position where he learned his role rather than dominating the divine narrative. This gradual development made him relatable to the people who honored him. As his identity continued forming through centuries of storytelling, Shara gained attributes that reflected the evolution of human conflict. The earliest portrayals did not show him leading armies or engaging in combat. Those roles emerged later as city-states grew more competitive. His birth symbolized the early realization that structured strength would be necessary. His development mirrored the social and political developments around him. The myths described him becoming what the world needed him to be. When considering the symbolic weight of his birth, it becomes clear that Shara emerged from a world in transition. Communities moved from small settlements to structured cities. Leadership became formalized. Conflict began shifting from instinctive disputes to organized confrontations. Deities evolved alongside these changes. Shara represented a new kind of divine presence that reflected the emerging understanding of disciplined strength. His birth signaled the arrival of an idea that would shape both mythology and reality. Each element associated with his origin carried meaning for the people who preserved his story. Storms symbolized raw power needing direction. Steel symbolized crafted strength shaped through effort. Starlight symbolized guidance during uncertainty. These elements, woven into the background of Shara's birth, helped articulate the values tied to him. He represented a balance of force and discipline that early societies were learning to cultivate. Even though his birth was not described in detailed narratives, the symbolic components that shaped it created a foundation for his later roles. He became a figure who represented readiness, loyalty, and responsibility. These traits appeared consistently throughout his mythology. As his role expanded to include organized conflict, these foundational elements remained present. The birth of Shara was not about spectacle. It was about the quiet formation of an identity that would later influence the way ancient people understood strength. The early stories of his origin show a god shaped by expectation rather than sudden action. His birth placed him in a world where the divine and human realms were both adapting to new forms of structure. His identity grew from the needs of the communities that honored him. The elements tied to his emergence strengthened the idea that even divine power required guidance. As his story continued, those early traits carried forward, shaping the figure who would eventually become known as a warrior among the Anunnaki. His beginnings form the steady groundwork for the responsibilities he later assumed. They reveal how ancient storytellers understood the development of strength, not as something abrupt, but as something that grows through time, guidance, and purpose. Those early footsteps shaped a god who would eventually stand at the threshold between order and conflict, ready to guide the world through the challenges that come with growth. Exploring how Shara learned the ways of war requires stepping into a period of his mythology that was shaped not by loud declarations or dramatic revelations, but by steady development. Many ancient deities were introduced as fully formed figures with established roles, yet Shara's identity grew piece by piece. The world that created him was evolving, and his story evolved alongside it. Before he ever stood as a symbol of disciplined conflict, he existed as a quiet divine child shaped by the expectations of those around him. His earliest years did not resemble the intense training scenes later cultures imagined for their warrior figures. Instead, they reflected a gradual education built on observation, duty, and responsibility. The tablets that mention him in this early context often present him in the orbit of powerful figures. Being tied to Inanna placed him within a complex network of divine relationships. Inanna's influence stretched across multiple domains, from political authority to the cycles of fertility. Her presence in myths was dynamic and sometimes unpredictable, yet she was often portrayed as demanding strength and loyalty from those associated with her. Shara, as a child within her sphere, absorbed the expectations tied to her position. He was not raised in isolation. He grew in an environment where authority and purpose shaped every aspect of divine life. His early education reflected the nature of the world he belonged to. Ancient Mesopotamian myths described the heavens not as a peaceful, unchanging realm, but as a structured place requiring order and cooperation. Each deity held responsibilities, and those responsibilities interacted constantly with the actions of others. The divine family operated much like the early cities that worshipped them, with negotiations, alliances, and tensions that needed careful management. Shara entered this environment as a young figure learning by watching those around him. He observed how divine authority worked. He saw how decisions were made, how disputes were resolved, and how strength was applied not to create chaos but to maintain balance. The education he received was not centered on combat alone. It included the broader understanding of how force should be structured. This foundation became essential to his later identity. Before he learned the techniques associated with warfare, he learned the context in which those techniques mattered. Strength without understanding had no place in the divine order. Shara's early years taught him that stability depended not only on power, but on knowing how and when to direct that power. The idea of a divine child learning through observation reflected the experiences of the people who created his story. Young individuals in early Mesopotamian societies learned about their roles through watching elders. Boys and girls absorbed the expectations of their communities long before taking on formal tasks. This quiet form of learning created a sense of continuity between generations. Shara's early education mirrored this cultural pattern. He learned gradually, absorbing the values that shaped his world. In many myths, deities grew into their roles through receiving responsibilities from older gods. These transitions weren't sudden. They unfolded as the stories developed. Shara followed a similar path. He wasn't assigned the duties associated with war immediately. His identity as a disciplined figure emerged through a slow accumulation of traits. His youth didn't diminish his importance. Instead, it gave him room to develop in ways that reflected the evolution of early societies. The concept of organized conflict was new, and his story grew in parallel with that development. One of the key aspects of his early portrayal was his quiet nature. Unlike figures described with forceful personalities or sudden bursts of power, Shara's presence came through steady references. The texts rarely attributed impulsive actions to him. Instead, they described him as reliable, loyal, and attentive. These qualities shaped the type of warrior he would eventually become. He was not a figure who sought conflict. He was one who learned how to manage it. His quiet nature allowed him to absorb teachings that required patience and discipline. Over time, these traits formed the basis for the training he received. The divine world was structured around roles that supported the stability of creation. Warfare in mythology was not portrayed as random destruction. It often symbolized cosmic balance, the the preservation of order against forces that threatened it. Shara's training reflected this understanding. He learned not only the physical aspects of conflict, but the reasoning behind them. He learned why strength mattered, why readiness mattered, and why the responsibility tied to conflict could not be taken lightly. These teachings often appeared in symbolic form. The earliest texts didn't describe Shara practicing with weapons or undergoing rituals associated with combat. Instead, they emphasized the values that shaped him. He learned loyalty first. He learned obedience to the divine hierarchy. He learned the importance of standing firm when others relied on him. These lessons prepared him for a type of strength that required control rather than aggression. The divine environment around him reinforced these ideas. Older gods demonstrated how authority functioned. Deities associated with judgment, protection, or justice influenced the lessons he absorbed. Even though myths rarely describe direct instruction, the structure of the pantheon provided constant examples of how power should be used. Shara's training took place within this larger system. He learned not through dramatic events, but through the steady influence of those who shaped the world. In many ways, his early development resembles the training of young guardians in early cities. Boys selected for roles involving defense were not simply taught how to fight. They were taught discipline, respect, and responsibility. They learned how to act on behalf of the community rather than for personal gain. These cultural expectations shaped the myths that described Shara. His development reflected the values people wanted in those who protected them. As Shara grew, he began to take on symbolic attributes associated with conflict. These attributes did not come from sudden revelations, they accumulated gradually. His association with weapons appeared in later periods, reflecting the shift in how conflict was understood. Before those symbols emerged, his role focused on readiness and order. His training involved understanding how conflict fit within the broader context of divine duties. He learned to interpret the signs of tension and to recognize when strength was necessary. These lessons shaped the foundation of his later identity. His quiet demeanor did not limit his potential, it strengthened it. A calm figure learning the ways of war offered a model of discipline rather than violence. Stories describing him at this stage emphasized the steadiness that made him reliable. His readiness came from within, built through patience and understanding. His development showed that warriors were not defined by the force they could unleash, but by the responsibility they carried. Another element of his upbringing involved the rituals surrounding divine youth. In many myths, young gods participated in ceremonies that marked transitions into new roles. These rituals reflected the passing of knowledge from one generation of gods to the next. Although the earliest records do not describe Shara's ceremonies directly, his later associations suggest that such rituals played a part in his development. The symbolism of rituals emphasized commitment, dedication, and duty. These concepts became central to his identity. The presence of divine training in mythology often symbolized the preparation needed for societal roles. As early cities grew more complex, their citizens depended on individuals who could maintain order. Warriors fulfilled that need, but they had to learn how to act on behalf of the community. Shara represented that training process. His transition from divine youth to disciplined guardian mirrored the changes occurring in the world that worshipped him. Through his story, people expressed their understanding that readiness was not innate. It had to be cultivated. Over time, Shara gained recognition as someone who embodied these values. His training was not glamorous. It did not involve dramatic moments or intense trials. Instead, it reflected the steady development of a figure learning how to support the divine world. His early years showed that strength developed gradually, shaped through dedication and guidance. These qualities made him a symbol of controlled power rather than uncontrolled force. His education continued as the myths surrounding him expanded. He began participating more actively in scenes involving divine assemblies. These scenes often dealt with decisions that affected both the heavens and the human world. By placing him in these contexts, storytellers showed that his training had moved beyond observation. He was becoming part of the structure that maintained order, This transition reflected both his growth and the growing need for organised strength in human societies. The presence of conflict in mythology increased as city-states developed. With these changes, Shara's training shifted to include more direct associations with warfare. Even so, his portrayal remained grounded in discipline. He learned not to strike without purpose. He learned to stand firm when stability was threatened. His training prepared him to manage the complexities of conflict, not to generate chaos. That distinction defined the type of warrior he became. The idea of a divine child gradually learning the ways of war also highlighted the human experience of growing into responsibility. Young men in early cities were expected to learn skills that protected their community. They trained through repetition, observation, and instruction. Shara's story mirrored this process, reinforcing the values associated with preparedness. His development helped communities articulate their expectations for those who held positions of strength. As his story progressed, the tools associated with his training grew more symbolic. Weapons mentioned in later texts represented not just physical objects, but the responsibilities tied to them. A spear symbolized vigilance, a shield symbolized protection, a sword symbolized authority. These tools reflected the values he had internalized during his youth. They were not symbols of aggression, they were symbols of readiness. The transformation from quiet divine child to disciplined figure reveals the foundation of Shara's identity. His development was not shaped by impulse or sudden revelation. It was shaped by a world learning how to understand conflict, how to prepare for it, and how to manage its consequences. His training reflected that understanding. He learned the ways of war not as a pursuit of violence, but as a duty to maintain order. His growth formed a steady path toward the responsibilities he would later hold. Through observation, guidance, and patience, he developed the qualities that shaped his role among the Anunnaki. His early years were defined by preparation rather than action. These foundations allowed him to step into a world where structured strength was becoming essential. The quiet, divine child learning the ways of war became a symbol of how societies learned to navigate conflict. Not through chaos, but through discipline. Not through destruction, but through understanding. His development offered a model for how strength should be shaped. His presence reflected the values of the people who told his story, and those values continued shaping his identity as his role expanded across centuries of myth. Understanding how the first weapons appeared in the stories of the gods means stepping into a moment where mythology and the earliest signs of organized human strength began to overlap. Before weapons became symbols of power, before armies marched under banners, and before conflict grew into something structured, there was a quieter stage in which myths absorbed the emerging realities of life. The earliest tools used by humans were not created for battle. They were created to cultivate fields, build homes, and shape materials. Yet over time, some tools took on different meanings, and myths began reflecting that shift. Shara stood at the center of this transition, not as a bringer of chaos, but as a figure who understood how strength could change shape. In ancient Mesopotamia, the development of weapons mirrored the transformation of society. As villages grew into towns and towns into cities, the need to defend resources increased. Irrigation systems took generations to build. Farmlands needed protection from both natural forces and human threats. These conditions encouraged people to see tools not just as extensions of effort, but as potential safeguards. Myths followed that change. When storytellers tried to express the complexity of a world where preparedness mattered, they turned to the divine realm. They depicted gods holding objects that symbolized readiness. These objects later evolved into weapons. Shara's presence in this stage of mythology reflected the cautious, deliberate introduction of conflict into divine narratives. He was not the first god to be associated with strength, but he was one of the earliest to embody disciplined force rather than raw elemental power. Storm gods, mountain gods, and underworld gods often displayed overwhelming strength that mirrored natural forces. Shara represented something different. His strength came from structure. He learned it through guidance, not instinct. His association with weapons emerged gradually as myths tried to articulate the early forms of organized conflict. When stories began describing him with weapons, those weapons carried symbolic meaning. They were not initially tied to violence. They represented responsibility. A spear might appear as a sign of vigilance, a reminder that communities depended on someone ready to stand at the boundary. A shield symbolized protection, not aggression. A sword, which appeared in later depictions, symbolized authority and decision-making rather than destruction. These tools were not about harming, they were about shaping stability. The earliest references to divine weapons in Mesopotamian texts rarely describe the tools in dramatic detail. Instead, they used them as markers of roles. When a god held a certain weapon, it signified the type of responsibility assigned to that deity. These responsibilities were practical reflections of human life. As early cities struggled to maintain boundaries and manage disputes, they imagined gods who understood those same challenges. Shara's first weapons fit into this pattern. They symbolized the readiness he had developed through observation and training. The transition from tools to weapons in mythology mirrored a similar transition in human society. Archaeologists have found that early agricultural tools gradually evolved into implements that could be used for defense. Axes became dual purpose. Spears, originally developed for hunting, also served as boundary keepers when communities clashed. In the same way, divine objects that initially symbolized guidance or authority began taking on the qualities of weapons as the stories grew more complex. Shara's association with these objects reflected the changes occurring across generations of storytelling. The idea of conflict entering the stories of gods did not begin with large-scale battles. It began with tension, with uncertainty, with the need to protect. Early myths described disagreements among gods, but these disagreements rarely escalated into war. They were symbolic reflections of the tensions that existed among early communities. When divine weapons first appeared, they represented the possibility of conflict rather than the inevitability of it. This cautious approach matched the way Shara's myth developed. His presence with a weapon did not mean he intended to use it without cause. It meant he was prepared for a world that was beginning to recognize conflict as part of life. The introduction of weapons into divine stories also served as a metaphor for leadership. Leaders in early cities were expected to make decisions that affected everyone under their care. These decisions sometimes required strength. The presence of weapons in myths taught communities that strength should be guided by discipline, not impulse. Shara embodied that principle. When stories described him holding a spear, they emphasized the responsibility behind the object more than the object itself. He represented the expectation that strength must be used carefully. As Mesopotamian cities grew more powerful, their political tensions increased. These tensions influenced the myths, gradually introducing more explicit scenes involving divine weapons. Yet even in these later stories, weapons were rarely depicted as instruments of destruction. They were depicted as symbols of authority, used with restraint. Shara's reputation as a figure who learned the ways of war slowly and deliberately contributed to this emphasis on restraint. His earliest weapons did not define him. They reflected the discipline he had cultivated. Another important aspect of his association with weapons was the ritual significance these objects carried. In temples, weapons were sometimes placed beside statues of deities. These offerings were not meant to invoke violence. They served as symbols of protection. Communities used them to express their hope that the gods watched over them. Weapons placed in temples were often made from precious materials, crafted with care and precision. Their presence indicated the value placed on safety and stability. Shara, associated with readiness and structured strength, became a natural recipient of such offerings. These ritual objects helped shape his image. They hinted at the idea that he carried tools imbued with meaning rather than instruments designed to harm. When scribes wrote about him, they emphasized the symbolic value of these objects. His spear was described as steady, his shield as dependable, and his sword as something that existed to uphold order. These descriptions aligned with the values the community sought to reinforce. Shara's first weapons were never presented as extensions of chaos. They were expressions of discipline. As conflict became more common among the city-states of Mesopotamia, divine weapons took on additional layers of meaning. Leaders invoked the names of gods associated with protection and discipline to legitimize their actions. Shara's presence in these contexts strengthened the idea that conflict, when it occurred, required structure. The first weapons in his story were reminders that strength needed justification. They represented the idea that war could be controlled and limited rather than allowed to spread without restraint. His association with weapons also influenced the roles he played in the rituals of initiation. In many communities, young men preparing for responsibilities tied to defense participated in ceremonies that involved symbolic weapons. These ceremonies marked their transition into adulthood. Shara became a patron figure for this process. His early experiences of learning strength with discipline made him an ideal guide for those entering similar roles. When the myths described his first weapons, they reflected not destruction but preparation. Over time, these ideas shaped a more detailed portrayal of him. He gained recognition as a figure capable of leading divine forces, not because he sought conflict, but because he understood the responsibility tied to it. The weaponry associated with him strengthened that identity. Stories described how he stood ready to support the divine order. His readiness symbolized the values that guided him through his early training. These values shaped the way conflict appeared in the divine world. The introduction of weapons into divine stories also revealed how early societies interpreted the relationship between humans and the gods. When people experienced conflict, they often sought meaning beyond their immediate circumstances. They looked to myths to understand why tensions arose. Weapons in divine stories provided a symbolic explanation. They suggested that conflict was part of a larger structure. It wasn't random, it had rules. Shara's role reinforced this idea. He represented organized strength, rather than uncontrolled violence. The myths that connected him to weapons also emphasized his patience. He did not rush into action. He acted when necessary. This portrayal helped communities shape their expectations for real-world conflict. Leaders sought to emulate the controlled nature of divine strength. Warriors trained to act with restraint. Shara's image holding his first weapons carried these lessons. It suggested that conflict required thought, preparation, and purpose. As myths evolved, the weapons associated with him became more recognizable. Spears and swords became standard symbols for deities tied to protection. Shields represented the defensive aspect of conflict. Bows appeared in later texts, symbolizing distance and calculation. These objects expanded Shara's role. They showed how myths adapted to new realities. Conflict in human society had grown more complex, and Shara's image reflected that complexity. Still, the earliest phase of his association with weapons remained foundational. Those early objects, symbolic rather than literal, shaped the meaning of his later identity. They showed that his training led him not toward aggression, but toward responsibility. His first weapons served as reminders that conflict required discipline. They offered an example of how strength could be used to maintain order rather than destroy it. The stories depicting his earliest encounters with weapons reveal an important shift in the way people understood the divine world. Before this shift, gods interacted with each other through natural forces or symbolic gestures. After weapons entered the stories, myths gained new layers of meaning. They reflected the idea that strength, once shaped into structured forms, could influence the world in new ways. Shara stood among the earliest figures to represent this transformation. His presence with weapons helped define what it meant for conflict to exist within divine stories. He demonstrated that strength needed guidance. He showed that weapons could symbolize more than violence. They could symbolize duty, They could symbolize preparation. They could symbolize the stability of a community depending on the care of those who protected it. The emergence of divine weapons marked a turning point in mythology. It signaled the moment when conflict shifted from instinctive responses to structured events. It marked the moment when communities recognized that strength had to be organized. Shara's first weapons captured this shift. They reflected the values shaping his development. They revealed the steady growth of a figure learning how to carry strength with responsibility. His early association with weapons created a foundation for his later roles. It prepared him for the responsibilities he would assume as human societies grew more complex. The first weapons in his story represented the beginning of his transformation. They symbolized the transition from readiness to action, from observation to responsibility. They showed how conflict entered the stories of gods through symbols of discipline rather than symbols of destruction. Shara's journey with these early weapons continued shaping him as he moved toward a more defined role. His steady development reflected the world that needed him. A world learning how to manage conflict, how to structure strength, and how to understand the responsibilities tied to power. The first weapons introduced in his mythology became part of this journey, guiding him toward the role he would eventually fulfill among the Anunnaki. Explaining why the Anunnaki began turning their attention toward conflict requires moving into a moment where mythology and the slow shifts of early human life began influencing each other more directly. Many ancient stories contain echoes of real social changes, wrapped in symbolic language meant to express ideas that were difficult to articulate in straightforward terms. The myths that eventually connected Shara and other divine figures to organize conflict did not emerge from a world obsessed with war. They emerged from societies learning how fragile stability could be when communities grew, competed for land, and faced pressures that had no easy solutions. The earliest Mesopotamian myths emphasize order, creation, and the establishment of predictable structures. Many stories describe the gods arranging the world, assigning roles, shaping rivers, and setting rhythms for human life. These stories reflected periods where people were learning agriculture, forming stable settlements, and creating the foundations of early civilization. The emphasis on harmony in these myths didn't suggest an unrealistic world without tension. Instead, it expressed an ideal. It was the aspiration of societies hoping to maintain consistency in the face of unpredictable natural forces. However, as settlements expanded into cities, harmony alone was no longer enough to maintain security. The reality of limited resources placed increasing pressure on different regions. Farmland had to be carefully managed, water sources needed protection, and political relationships between cities became more complex. When disputes arose, they required structured solutions. Mythology responded by adjusting the roles of the gods. Stories that once focused only on creation and order began incorporating scenes of tension, disagreement, and competition. These changes did not suggest that the gods became violent. They suggested that divine stories were beginning to mirror the challenges people faced. Among the Anunnaki, the presence of conflict did not appear suddenly. It grew gradually, reflecting the slow transformation of human society. The earliest hints of divine tension appear in small details within hymns, poems, and ceremonial inscriptions. These details aren't dramatic. They're subtle mentions of disputes, authority, or the need for protection. They show that the idea of conflict was beginning to take on new meaning. It wasn't about destruction. It was about the realization that maintaining order required strength. In this shifting environment, the roles of certain gods began adjusting. Deities tied to justice, leadership, and protection grew more prominent. Their stories emphasized responsibility and control. Others, tied to natural forces or ancestral roles, maintained their earlier positions. The emerging idea of organized conflict required figures who understood structure. This is where Shara's development became important. His training, patience, and disciplined nature positioned him to embody the value societies associated with controlled strength. The turn toward combat in divine narratives did not begin with anger or aggression. It began with concern. Stories describe the Anunnaki watching the world they had shaped and recognizing the growing complexity within it. People were forming laws, building fortifications, and navigating disputes that had consequences for entire communities. These developments required the gods to take on roles that matched the new realities. Deities who once oversaw more peaceful domains now became responsible for interpreting what conflict meant and how it should be managed. One of the earliest influences behind this shift was the rise of territorial identity. As cities developed unique cultures, dialects, and rituals, the relationship between them grew more competitive. Each city had its own patron deity. These gods were seen as protectors of their people, and loyalty to a city often translated into loyalty to its divine guardian. When two cities competed for land or water rights, their conflicts gained symbolic weight in mythology. The stories of gods interacting with each other reflected these tensions, though always in a controlled and structured manner. The Anunnaki's turn toward combat reflected this social transformation. The idea wasn't that the gods wished for violence. It was that they recognized the need to manage conflict. This management required leadership, structure, and discipline. Gods associated with these qualities gained prominence. Shara, whose earliest roles emphasized preparation and observation, became one of the figures who symbolized the transition from peaceful order to structured strength. The concept of divine combat in Mesopotamian mythology differed significantly from myths in other regions. It did not usually involve chaotic battles between gods. Instead, it involved the symbolic act of establishing authority over disorder. In some stories, gods confronted forces that represented chaos. These scenes were not about conflict between divine beings, but about reaffirming the structure of the world. These myths suggested that conflict, when handled correctly, restored balance rather than disturbed it. The shift toward divine attention on combat also paralleled the development of early warfare among humans. The earliest documented conflicts in Mesopotamia were small, organised events involving boundaries and irrigation systems. These disputes had significant consequences for the survival of cities. Leaders needed to justify the decisions they made during these conflicts. Turning to the gods for guidance provided legitimacy as well as reassurance. When divine stories showed the Anunnaki acknowledging tension, it gave communities a framework for understanding their own struggles. This connection between myth and reality strengthened as political structures grew more defined. Kings became central figures in maintaining stability. Their authority depended on the perception that they could protect their people. Myths about divine figures learning or demonstrating disciplined strength reinforced this expectation. Shara's growing role as a symbolic guardian reflected the values associated with leadership. His development helped define what it meant for a figure to represent protection in a world where peace could not be assumed. Stories involving the Anunnaki turning their attention to combat were not created to glorify violence. They were created to explain why communities needed strength. They emphasized the idea that conflict required purpose, not impulse. Divine involvement in conflict suggested that even gods recognized the weight of such decisions. This portrayal encouraged leaders and warriors to adopt similar restraint. Shara's steady presence in these myths offered an example of strength shaped by understanding rather than aggression. As myths continued evolving, they began describing divine assemblies, discussing matters that affected both gods and humans. These discussions sometimes involved disagreements. They reflected the complexity of maintaining order in a world that was expanding socially and politically. The introduction of tension into divine interactions did not diminish the harmony of the pantheon. It showed that harmony required effort. It showed that even divine beings had to navigate responsibilities carefully. The earliest weapons associated with Shara and other gods appeared in this context. They symbolized readiness, not destruction. They represented the acknowledgement that conflict had become part of life. The Anunnaki did not turn their eyes toward combat because they sought disorder. They did so because they recognized that strength needed to be part of maintaining balance. Their presence in these early stories reflected the values that communities relied on: courage, discipline, and the willingness to protect. The expansion of divine roles continued as city-states entered periods of political rivalry. These rivalries influenced the way gods were portrayed. When two cities competed, their myths often emphasized the protective roles of their deities. This did not mean that the gods fought each other directly. It meant that their symbolic roles expanded to include the possibility of conflict. Stories describing divine readiness signaled the growing importance of structured defense. Shara's presence in these stories highlighted his steady development into a figure capable of supporting the divine order during tension. The shift from peace to tension in mythology reflected the uncertainties of early civilization. People relied on the gods to help them understand events beyond their control. When they faced conflict, they looked for meaning in the divine realm. The Anunnaki turning their attention toward combat provided that meaning. It showed that conflict was not outside the structure of the world. It showed that conflict, when approached with discipline, could reinforce stability. Over time, this theme became central to Shara's identity. His early education positioned him to understand the responsibilities tied to strength. His gradual association with weapons prepared him for a role that required both caution and decisiveness. His presence in stories of divine tension suggested that the gods valued preparation over impulse. These themes grew more important as societies developed more complex political systems. The portrayal of divine tension also served a practical purpose. It reminded communities that conflict had consequences. Stories emphasized the importance of making careful decisions. They suggested that even gods approached conflict with restraint. This perspective influenced the expectations placed on leaders. It encouraged them to act thoughtfully. It encouraged warriors to understand that their role was not to seek violence, but to protect stability. The Anunnaki's turn toward combat in mythology became a reflection of the maturing structure of human societies. As people learned to organize themselves, they needed a framework that explained when and why conflict occurred. Mythology provided this framework. It connected divine behavior to human responsibility. It showed that preparation and control were central to managing tension. Shara's development mirrored this cultural understanding. The myths describing the Anunnaki recognizing tension often emphasized the need to protect creation. They portrayed conflict as an extension of the work required to maintain order. These themes revealed a worldview where strength served a purpose. Shara's steady presence in these stories showed that the transition from peace to tension was not chaotic. It was guided. It was deliberate. It reflected the values shaping early civilization. As divine stories continued evolving, the boundaries between peace and tension became more defined. This did not eliminate the ideal of harmony. It expanded it. Harmony was no longer seen as the absence of conflict. It was seen as the result of careful management. The Anunnaki's attention to conflict represented this expanded understanding. It showed that maintaining order required awareness of instability. It showed that divine figures needed to be ready to act. The transition toward conflict in mythology revealed the maturity of early thought. Ancient societies recognized that strength had to be controlled. They understood that survival depended on readiness. Shara embodied these realizations. His development into a figure associated with disciplined combat grew from a world that valued stability above triumph. His story demonstrated that conflict was not inevitable, but preparation was necessary. The shift from peace to tension did not transform the Anunnaki into violent beings. It transformed them into figures capable of guiding humans through the complexities of a growing world. Their attention toward combat represented a recognition of responsibility. Their actions symbolized the effort required to protect order. Shara's role continued to grow within this framework, shaping him into a figure who understood the weight of strength. Through these developments, mythology reflected the evolution of human civilization. It showed how societies learned to navigate tension. It showed how stories adapted to changing realities. It showed how divine roles expanded as human needs evolved. The Anunnaki turning their eyes toward combat captured this transformation. Their shift did not erase the importance of peace. It emphasized the effort needed to maintain it. When the earlier stories began describing Shara stepping into a more active role, they did not present him as a sudden figure of overwhelming force. His emergence into a position associated with leadership came slowly, shaped by centuries of myth-making and the shifting needs of the people who told his story. He was never depicted as a deity who demanded attention or commanded through sheer volume. His ascent into a guiding role developed quietly, in ways that reflected his earlier traits of discipline, loyalty, and measured strength. When he took his place at the front of divine processions or appeared carrying symbolic banners, the impact came not from surprise but from recognition that his steady preparation had finally led him to a role waiting for him all along. The idea of Shara marching did not begin with scenes of warfare. Most of his earliest associations with movement depicted formal, organised processions tied to rituals or ceremonial duties. These scenes showed him participating in acts that reinforced the structure of the divine world rather than disrupting it. His presence indicated readiness, not aggression. The banner he carried in these descriptions was not a call to chaos. It was a sign of commitment to order. Such imagery reflected the values of the culture that shaped him. Ancient Mesopotamians valued process, hierarchy, and predictability. They believed that the divine world mirrored these elements. When Shara stepped forward with a banner, it symbolized readiness to support the structure holding the world in balance. His march gained meaning through the contrast between expectation and action. Many deities known for strength began their myths with spectacular displays of power. They erupted into the stories fully equipped with dramatic feats. Shara developed differently. His growth came through observation, training, and steady accumulation of responsibility. For this reason, when myths finally described him at the front of divine forces, the moment carried weight precisely because he had not previously sought such a role. His quiet nature meant that any step he took conveyed intention. His march was interpreted as an act of duty rather than ambition. As human societies grew more complex and political tensions increased, the symbolism of banners evolved. Banners represented identity, unity, and authority. They marked boundaries, organized groups, and signaled purpose. When the myths introduced Shara carrying a banner, they were connecting him to these emerging concepts. It meant that he was recognized not only as a student of divine strength, but as someone capable of guiding it. His banner was not a tool of domination. It represented direction. It indicated that he knew how to unite those who followed him and steady those who depended on his discipline. The earliest texts that reference Shara in this role describe him as a figure leading divine attendants, or supporting Inanna during ceremonial displays of authority. These scenes reinforced the idea that he had become someone others trusted. His march was not performed alone. It occurred within the context of the divine assembly. The Anunnaki did not act independently. Their roles intersected, creating a network of responsibilities. Shara's presence at the front of these groups demonstrated that he had earned a place among deities who maintained order. His march reflected the expectations placed upon him and the steady confidence he had built over time. Another dimension of Shara's march involved the symbolism of movement itself. Movement in divine narratives often carried significance. It marked transitions, changes in responsibility, or shifts in cosmic balance. When Shara began marching in myths, it indicated that he had moved from the quiet periphery of divine youth to an active role in maintaining stability. His movement represented progress, not disruption. It showed that he was entering a stage where he would handle responsibilities that required decisiveness. The steadiness of his march communicated that he approached these duties with the same calm preparation that characterized his upbringing. The stories of Shara carrying a banner also resonated with the rituals performed in his temples. Priests and initiates sometimes participated in processions that echoed the movements described in the myths. These rituals reinforced the idea that steady preparation led to structured leadership. Participants learned discipline through repeated motions, memorized chants, and the careful handling of symbolic objects. Shara's calm, purposeful march became a model for those ceremonies. The banner raised in myth and ritual alike represented the shared understanding that order required guidance. The absence of dramatic flair in these stories made them meaningful. Shara's march did not rely on spectacle. It relied on the respect earned through patience and dedication. His presence at the front of divine processions indicated that he was trusted. The people who told his stories recognized that leadership did not always come from assertiveness. It could emerge from consistency. His march represented a culmination of the teachings he had absorbed and the values he embodied. It symbolized that a figure shaped by steady guidance could become the one others followed when structure was needed. As the myths began incorporating more explicit references to conflict, Shara's role as a leader grew more prominent. He evolved from a guardian into a figure who could guide divine forces when necessary. His banner became associated with the idea of moving toward tension with purpose rather than reacting to it impulsively. This portrayal aligned with the values of early city-states, which understood that leadership during conflict required discipline, preparation, and a calm approach. Shara's steady march embodied these qualities, reinforcing the idea that strength needed direction. The stories depicting him leading divine attendants likely developed alongside the growing organized structures of early armies. These armies did not begin as large forces. They formed gradually from groups of trained individuals responsible for protecting boundaries and resolving disputes. Their development required organization, signaling, and clear chains of command. Banners played a role in controlling movement, maintaining cohesion, and establishing identity. Shara's connection to these symbols mirrored the shifts occurring in human society. As armies learned how to coordinate movement, myth gave those actions divine significance. His march also reflected the change in how conflict was perceived. Earlier societies experienced disputes in small personal settings. As populations increased, conflicts grew larger and required more structured approaches. Myths responded by portraying divine figures participating in acts that resembled early forms of coordinated defense. Shara's march was not a conquest. It was a demonstration of organized readiness. It conveyed that the gods understood the new demands placed upon their followers. His movement symbolized the broader transition from instinctive responses to deliberate actions. The transformation of his banner from a ceremonial symbol to one associated with disciplined conflict occurred gradually. In the earliest portrayals, the banner marked his connection to ritual responsibilities. Over time, as myths reflected more complex ideas, the banner gained additional layers of meaning. It came to represent leadership during tension. It signaled unity among divine figures. It suggested that Shara had learned how to guide strength without allowing it to spiral into destructiveness. His banner was a reminder that authority needed clarity. The steady nature of his march also distinguished him from deities whose actions represented unpredictable natural forces. Storm gods moved with sudden bursts of intensity. Underworld gods brought movement associated with cycles beyond human control. Shara's movement reflected a different kind of energy. It reflected determination shaped through discipline. His march was predictable, controlled, and purposeful. It showed that he embodied a type of strength that societies valued as they navigated growing tensions. His rise into a leadership role was unexpected, not because he lacked qualities associated with strength, but because his earlier portrayal emphasized quiet development rather than dramatic emergence. Many myths describe formidable gods appearing with fully formed attributes, ready to act from the moment they enter the narrative. Shara's story unfolded at a different pace. He grew into his role. His march symbolized that growth. When he carried a banner, it marked the moment when observers recognized that the quiet divine child who learned steady discipline had become a figure capable of guiding others. This development reflects a broader principle seen throughout ancient mythologies. Many cultures included figures who transitioned from humble beginnings into significant roles. These transitions represented the reality that leadership could emerge from unexpected places. Shara's steady journey exemplified this theme. His march reminded communities that those who observed, listened, and prepared often became the ones who led during times of tension. The symbolism of his banner also connected him to the idea of identity. In early Mesopotamian society, banners were markers of belonging. They indicated the community, deity, or leader that a group represented. When Shara carried a banner, it signaled that he was not acting independently. He represented the values of the divine assembly. His march affirmed his commitment to upholding the order established by the Anunnaki. It reinforced the idea that leadership within the divine world was intertwined with communal responsibility. As myths continued describing Shara's role, his presence became more closely tied to the concept of moving toward conflict with purpose. He didn't charge or rush, he advanced steadily. This steady advancement became a metaphor for the approach ancient societies desired from their leaders. When conflict appeared, it needed to be met with clear intention rather than impulsive reaction. Shara's march symbolized that intention. It demonstrated that readiness involved both physical strength and mental clarity. The stories describing his movement also contributed to the development of rituals associated with him. These rituals often emphasize slow, deliberate sequences designed to instill stability. Processions dedicated to Shara encouraged participants to internalize the values he represented. Carrying a banner in these rituals required care, balance, and focus. These elements reinforced the disciplined nature associated with his myth. His march became a model for how individuals should respond to responsibility. The significance of his role grew as myths expanded to include scenes where divine figures had to intervene in disputes affecting the human world. These scenes never portrayed the gods acting recklessly. They portrayed them acting with intention. Shara's position at the front of divine processions symbolized the importance of approaching conflict with preparation. His march reflected a mindset that valued assessment and structure. Stories describing him in this role helped reinforce the idea that conflict should be handled with foresight. The unexpected nature of his leadership came from the contrast between his early life and his later responsibilities. He began as a quiet figure learning through observation. He entered divine narratives gradually. His presence never dominated early myths. For this reason, when he eventually stepped forward carrying a banner, the moment carried significance. It demonstrated that leadership could emerge from steady growth. It offered reassurance that consistency mattered as much as intensity. As human societies grew more organized, they needed models that reinforced disciplined approaches to conflict. Shara's march provided that model. His presence in myths encouraged communities to view strength not as something chaotic, but as something that required control. When he carried a banner, it suggested that leadership came from understanding, not simply from power. This portrayal helped shape expectations placed on those responsible for guiding communities during difficult times. Shara's march ultimately represented more than the movement of a single deity. It represented the evolution of conflict from instinctive reaction to structured action. It reflected the values that allowed societies to manage tension without losing stability. It showed that leadership could be quiet, deliberate, and rooted in responsibility. His steady movement echoed through centuries of storytelling, reminding those who heard his name that strength without discipline could not maintain order. His journey into a role associated with guiding divine forces marked a significant progression in his identity. He had learned the values necessary to carry the weight of a banner. He had developed the discipline needed to represent order during tension. His march revealed the culmination of everything he had absorbed during his early years. It helped shape the meaning of conflict within the divine world and influenced the way communities understood the responsibilities tied to strength. As stories continued unfolding, Shara's steady presence remained central to the evolving understanding of how societies navigated tension. His unexpected rise into leadership embodied the belief that preparedness, patience, and commitment were essential for those entrusted with guiding others. His march carried these values forward, setting the stage for the next development in his story, when the lessons he had learned became part of the way conflict entered the human world under divine guidance. Explaining how warfare first appeared in the world of mortals requires slowly tracing the relationship ancient people imagined between themselves and the divine. In early Mesopotamian thought, nothing that humans did existed in isolation. Every skill, decision, and transformation in society seemed to have a reflection in the heavens. The gods were not distant myths in those early days. They were woven into the rhythm of daily life. People believed that the changes shaping their communities were guided by divine precedents. When conflict began taking on a structured form, it made sense for them to understand that development is something learned from the gods, not invented independently. Shara, with his steady evolution into a figure who embodied disciplined strength, naturally became part of this imagined transfer of knowledge. The earliest human conflicts were not the wars later civilizations would record in chronicles. They were small disputes, territorial misunderstandings, clashes sparked by scarcity, or simple disagreements between neighbouring groups. These events were unpredictable and personal. Yet as settlements grew into organised communities, people needed clearer ways of managing disputes. Stories evolved to describe these new realities, and one of the ways they explained the rise of conflict was through divine instruction. It wasn't a matter of gods forcing violence upon humans. It was a matter of mortals learning to survive in an increasingly complex world, guided by divine examples of discipline and structure. Shara's role in this imagined connection came from the qualities cultivated in his early story. He wasn't portrayed as a disruptive force. He symbolized readiness, controlled strength, and a calm approach to responsibility. These traits made him the kind of figure communities could imagine guiding mortals quietly. His presence in myths suggested that the knowledge of how to manage conflict didn't originate from chaos. It came from figures who understood order. The myths describing this transition rarely included scenes of gods directly handing mortals weapons or drilling them in combat. Instead, they showed gods embodying values that mortals interpreted and applied to their own lives. When Shara marched with a banner, people saw discipline. When he stood prepared with symbolic weapons, they saw the need for caution. These impressions shaped the way societies approach conflict. They believed that understanding how to protect their communities reflected alignment with divine expectations. As agricultural life expanded, communities depended on organised labour to maintain irrigation canals, store grain, and manage resources. These tasks required cooperation. They also created new points of tension. When a canal's water flow changed direction, two villages might argue over access. When a harvest failed, competition for resources intensified. These pressures required leadership. They required decisions that sometimes led to confrontation. Mythology responded by showing divine figures navigating similar challenges. Shara's role in these stories helped articulate how strength could be used responsibly. The first structured forms of warfare likely emerged from the need to protect resources. People learned how to defend fields and boundaries. They learned how to stand guard. They learned how to organize groups of individuals who could act together when danger approached. These early developments shaped the earliest portrayals of warriors. They were not raiders or conquerors. They were caretakers of stability. Shara's symbolism fit that role naturally. His calm, disciplined nature mirrored the values communities needed when preparing for tension. In myths, gods often guided mortals through indirect influence rather than explicit action. They demonstrated the principles that humans interpreted as instructions. If a god acted with discipline during divine tensions, Mortals understood that discipline was expected of them. If gods carried ceremonial weapons with intention, mortals learned that weapons should serve responsibility. These ideas influenced the formation of early warrior traditions. The role of the warrior became tied not only to physical skill, but to moral expectations. The association between divine guidance and human conflict also helped justify the difficult decisions leaders had to make. When a city faced threats, leaders needed to motivate their people. Connecting human actions to divine precedents gave those actions legitimacy. A decision to defend boundaries could be presented not as a desire for violence, but as a duty aligned with the gods. Shara's steady presence in myths offered a model for leaders. His disciplined approach suggested that strength used thoughtfully was honourable. Over time, as communities grew more complex, organised defence became part of daily life. Walls were built, watchtowers appeared. Weapons were crafted not only for hunting but for protection. These developments reflected a world recognising that peace required effort. Myths adapted by emphasising divine figures who embodied readiness. Shara's development mirrored this change. His presence in stories reflected the belief that the discipline shaping early societies had divine origin. The idea that gods taught mortals the foundations of warfare did not imply direct instruction. It implied that humans saw divine order reflected in their own needs. When the Anunnaki turned their attention toward conflict in myth, humans interpreted that as a signal that they too needed to understand conflict's place in their world. This connection made the emergence of structured warfare feel natural rather than disruptive. It aligned human action with divine expectation. Shara's role helped anchor this idea. His steady movement into leadership symbolized the progression from preparation to action. His banner represented identity. His weapons symbolized responsibility. These elements helped early societies see conflict not as a descent into chaos, but as an organized response to instability. The myths surrounding him suggested that discipline made conflict manageable. They suggested that strength paired with understanding could maintain order. The first human warriors likely learned their roles through the gradual formalization of guard duties and boundary defense. They trained to react carefully, not recklessly. Their responsibilities included protecting livestock, preventing theft, and maintaining peace between neighbouring groups. These duties matched the values found in Shara's early portrayal. He was not a figure of rage or destruction. He represented controlled readiness. His association with early warfare reinforced the idea that warriors served their communities through stability, not aggression. Ritual played an important role in how people understood the connection between divine guidance and human action. Ceremonies honouring protective gods often included symbolic objects representing strength. These rituals helped individuals internalise the values needed for their responsibilities. In some temples, offerings of miniature weapons or carefully crafted banners expressed devotion to deities associated with order. These objects were not used for violence. They reflected the community's desire for protection. Shara often appeared in context tied to these rituals. His story provided the framework for understanding why such offerings mattered. The belief that divine figures taught mortals the foundations of warfare also offered a way to reconcile the discomfort communities felt when facing conflict. Warfare, even in its early stages, carried heavy consequences. It disrupted trade, it risked lives, it affected families. By attributing the knowledge of structured conflict to divine influence, communities assured themselves that conflict, when handled responsibly, aligned with the natural order. This belief reduced anxiety and reinforced unity. Shara's calm presence in myths supported this need for reassurance. As the political landscape expanded, the scale of conflict grew. City-states vied for influence. Alliances formed and dissolved. Leaders looked to divine narratives for guidance on how to navigate these changes. Shara's role grew alongside these developments. His steady advancement into a guiding position reflected the increasing organisation of human warfare. When myths described him at the front of divine assemblies, humans saw a model for their own leadership structures. The act of marching became a metaphor for moving toward conflict with clarity and purpose. The gradual development of weapons in both myth and reality reinforced this connection. Early weapons were simple: spears, axes, and slings. Their effectiveness came from coordination rather than individual strength. This reality shaped the way divine weapons were described. They symbolized authority and discipline. Shara's association with these objects helped interpret warfare as an organized act rather than chaotic violence. His presence reminded communities that strength needed direction. The dawn of warfare in human societies did not occur suddenly. It emerged through generations of learning, adaptation, and necessity. Myths helped guide this process by providing a framework of meaning. They suggested that conflict existed within the structure of the world, not outside it. They showed that gods recognized the need for strength during tension. Shara's development became a symbolic representation of this progression. His steady rise from quiet divine youth to disciplined leader illustrated how societies grew into the responsibilities tied to conflict. As more detailed myths emerged, they began describing interactions between gods and mortals that hinted at the transfer of knowledge. These interactions were not instructional in the literal sense. They depicted gods watching, guiding through example, or responding to human petitions. Shara's portrayal often included scenes where his presence signaled readiness. Leaders interpreted these moments as signs to prepare their communities. Warriors interpreted them as encouragement to uphold discipline. The mythic relationship between Shara and mortals became an ongoing dialogue shaped by changing circumstances. The stories that connected Shara to the dawn of warfare did so carefully. They never portrayed him as imposing violence. They emphasized responsibility, patience, and clarity. These values aligned with the practical needs of early societies. Leaders required legitimacy. Warriors required purpose. Communities required reassurance. Myth provided all three. Shara's symbolic role served as an anchor for these needs. His presence suggested that conflict, when necessary, could be approached with dignity. Ritual traditions reinforced these ideas further. Before engaging in any form of conflict, leaders often sought divine approval. They made offerings. They recited prayers. They asked for guidance on how to maintain balance. Shara's association with structured strength made him an important figure during these ceremonies. His calm demeanor in myth reminded participants that conflict required thought, not impulse. The act of seeking divine approval became a way to ensure that actions aligned with the values embodied by figures like Shara. The introduction of warfare into human life also reshaped the social identity of those responsible for defending communities. Warriors were no longer simply individuals with stronger bodies or sharper instincts. They became symbols of social responsibility. Their position carried expectations beyond physical ability. Stories about Shara helped define these expectations. His disciplined approach set a standard for behavior. His steady readiness shaped the image of what a responsible warrior should be. As myths developed further, Shara's role continued expanding, but always remained grounded in the values that characterized his early story. He never became a symbol of reckless violence. He represented calculated strength. His influence shaped the understanding of how conflict entered the human world. He embodied the idea that warfare evolved from the need to protect, not from the desire to dominate. The dawn of warfare on Earth, according to these myths, reflected the transition of human society from fragile settlements to organized civilizations. Conflict became an inevitable part of maintaining order, in a world where resources were limited and tensions grew with every expansion. The gods did not teach mortals to create chaos. They taught them how to manage instability. Shara's role illustrated that teaching. His steady path showed how strength could be shaped responsibly. The connection between gods and mortals during this formative period helped shape the cultural identity of entire regions. Warfare was never portrayed as desirable. it was portrayed as necessary under certain conditions. Myths anchored this reality in divine purpose. They provided guidance for how to approach actions that carried deep consequences. Shara's steady presence in these stories reassured communities that structure and discipline were the foundation of strength. This understanding set the stage for the next developments in both myth and society. As cities grew larger and conflicts grew more complex, the symbolic relationship between gods and mortals continued influencing behaviour. Shara's role helped bridge the gap between divine order and human action. His story provided a path for understanding the weight of responsibility tied to conflict. As the myths expanded, his influence remained tied to the belief that strength existed not for dominance but for the preservation of stability. When the first cities rose from the riverbanks of Mesopotamia, they carried with them a sense of pride and vulnerability that shaped everything the people inside them believed. The land around the rivers had always been fertile, but once walls began forming and canals extended outward in careful lines, settlements took on new meaning. They were no longer temporary clusters of homes. They became symbols of identity. They became extensions of the people who built them. These early cities glowed with potential, but they also highlighted fragility. Inside those walls, people realized that strength held benefits, yet also required sacrifices. It was in this delicate space that myths surrounding gods like Shara deepened. Because strength, once embraced, demanded constant attention. The earlier cities were not vast metropolises. They were modest collections of homes, shrines, storehouses, and meeting places. Yet even in their earliest forms, they represented something unprecedented: the concentration of human effort into a shared structure. This concentration meant progress, but it also meant risk. Communities were no longer scattered across wide landscapes. They depended on the success of a single area. A flood could undo years of work. A drought could place strain on every household. And disagreements with neighbouring settlements could escalate quickly. These conditions made the idea of strength both appealing and intimidating. People sought guidance in these moments. They turned to their gods to understand how to preserve what they had built. The divine world offered structure. It offered reassurance that their efforts mattered. Stories about the Anunnaki reflected these needs. They portrayed the gods as caretakers of order, guardians of stability. Within these stories, Shara's role gained significance. His careful, disciplined approach to conflict matched the new reality of life inside walls. Cities needed guardians, not conquerors, and his traits reflected that requirement. The rise of cities also brought new pressures on leadership. Leaders had to make decisions affecting hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. They managed resources, negotiated with neighbours, and prepared for crises. These responsibilities created expectations. A leader was expected to act with authority while remaining accountable to the community. Myths helped articulate the qualities needed for this role. Shara's steady presence became a symbolic guide. His readiness, patience, and measured approach offered an example for how leaders should handle strength. As cities grew and populations increased, tensions naturally rose. Different groups competed for land, water access, and trade routes. These disputes did not always escalate into conflict, but they created a constant undercurrent of uncertainty. The first large-scale confrontations between cities in Mesopotamia often began with arguments over boundary markers or irrigation rights. These arguments reflected basic survival needs. A canal blocked or redirected could destroy fields downstream. A disputed field could determine whether a community had enough grain to last through winter. When leaders faced these pressures, they made decisions shaped by both practicality and myth. They sought reassurance that their actions aligned with divine guidance. Shara's disciplined nature offered such reassurance. Unlike deities associated with chaotic natural forces, he embodied control and structure. His symbolic weapons reflected readiness rather than aggression. His march represented purpose rather than dominance. These qualities became important as cities began experiencing the first true costs of strength. When communities relied on organised defence, they accepted certain sacrifices. Men who joined protective groups spent less time in fields. Communities invested resources into watchtowers, fortifications and training. These commitments shaped daily life. Strength came with effort. Over time, the monuments and structures within cities grew more impressive. Temples rose higher, built with layers of carefully placed bricks. Storage facilities expanded to hold surplus grain. Workshops produced tools and goods that reflected increasing specialization. These developments made cities appear strong, yet they also created new vulnerabilities. A larger city attracted attention. It required more resources. It needed more hands to maintain its structures. The mythic world supported this transformation. Stories emphasized the presence of gods who oversaw prosperity and protection. Shara's role in particular became associated with the idea that growth required discipline. The connection between cities and divine authority grew stronger as political systems developed. Kingship emerged as a central institution. A king was responsible for maintaining order, managing resources and defending the city. Myths described kings as chosen by the gods, carrying divine favour or duty. Shara's association with disciplined strength shaped how early kings viewed their responsibilities. They sought to embody his values. They performed rituals that aligned their actions with divine expectations. These rituals served as reminders that strength required accountability. The economic systems of early cities also influenced the development of structured conflict. Surplus grain and goods encouraged trade, but trade routes needed protection. Merchants travelling long distances depended on safe passage. Some cities formed alliances to ensure mutual stability. Others attempted to control trade by force. These developments increased the need for organised warriors. A city could not maintain influence without a group capable of protecting its interests. As warfare became more structured, myths adapted. Shara's symbolic role grew to reflect the understanding that strength required coordination. The physical appearance of early warriors changed as well. At first, they carried tools that served multiple purposes. Spears used for hunting doubled as defensive weapons. Over time, specialized equipment emerged. Helmets hardened by baked clay or metal, reinforced shields, and weapons designed for combat rather than work. These developments represented the growing distinction between daily labor and organized defense. Mythic imagery responded by giving divine figures more defined symbolic tools. Shara's weapons became clear indicators of his readiness. Their controlled presence in myths reinforced the idea that tools of conflict carried heavy meaning. The development of writing further shaped the way cities understood strength. Records allowed leaders to track resources, mark boundaries, and preserve laws. Written disputes over land and water became part of official archives. When conflicts emerged, those archives provided justification for decisions. Writing gave structure to both diplomacy and confrontation. Myths preserved in writing reflected these changes. They depicted divine figures considering petitions, debating responsibilities, and responding with measured judgment. Shara's portrayal aligned with this analytical approach. His disciplined development fit the worldview of societies learning to document their problems. The first recorded conflicts between city-states, such as those involving Lagash and Yuma, illustrate how the price of strength became evident. These conflicts were small compared to later wars, but they represented a shift. Cities fought to enforce boundaries or protect resources, and the consequences affected entire communities. These early confrontations required planning, coordination, and leadership. They also required justification. Leaders often invoked divine authority to support their decisions. Shara's association with controlled conflict made him a natural reference point. His presence in myths offered a foundation for interpreting difficult choices. The social cost of maintaining strength also grew clearer. Families who contributed members to guard duties faced changes in household routines. Fields might go untended during times of tension. Communities needed to provide food and materials for those dedicated to defence. These sacrifices became part of the collective identity of a city. People understood that the stability of their home depended on the effort of many. Mythic narratives reflected this collective understanding. They portrayed deities working together to maintain order. Shara's presence among divine groups echoed the coordination required among human defenders. The emergence of city walls symbolized both pride and caution. Walls represented the ability to protect what had been built. They also signaled that threats existed. Constructing walls required enormous effort. Workers shaped bricks, carried materials, and aligned structures carefully. The act of building walls itself became a statement of strength. These structures influenced myths. They encouraged stories about gods who stood at boundaries, ensuring the safety of their people. Shara's disciplined image fit naturally into this narrative. His association with vigilance matched the symbolic meaning of the walls surrounding the cities. The rituals performed at city gates further illustrated the connection between divine guidance and human strength. Gateways were significant locations, used for both civic decisions and ceremonial events. Priests and leaders gathered at these spots to make offerings or interpret omens. These rituals reinforced the belief that the city's stability depended on alignment with divine will. Shara's disciplined persona influenced these interpretations. His steady approach offered a model for how strength should be applied when protecting the boundaries of a city. Trade relationships also influenced the perception of strength. Cities depended on goods from distant regions. They needed materials not found locally. When trade expanded, cities formed networks of mutual benefit. Yet these networks created new vulnerabilities. Trade routes passed through unpredictable territories. Caravan leaders hired guards. Cities negotiated agreements or formed protective alliances. These developments increased the importance of organized strength. Myths adapted by incorporating scenes where gods supported exchanges or guided travelers. Shara's presence in these interpretations reflected the belief that discipline ensured safety. The price of strength became especially visible during times of scarcity. When floods damaged crops or drought reduced harvests, the stability of cities faltered. People depended on the resources stored during prosperous years. Leaders had to ensure that supplies were protected and distributed fairly. Tensions increased as communities struggled to survive. Myths portraying divine figures responding to crises helped reassure people that their struggles mirrored challenges faced in the divine world. Shara's calm presence offered symbolic guidance during these difficult periods. His disciplined nature reminded people that maintaining order required commitment. Another consequence of strength involved the shifting identity of cities themselves. As communities expanded, they created systems of governance, religion, and culture that set them apart from neighbours. This growing sense of identity often led to rivalry. Cities wanted recognition. They wanted their achievements to endure. They built larger temples, hosted festivals, and recorded accomplishments in inscriptions. These expressions of pride made myths even more important. They linked a city's identity to its divine patrons. Shara's role among such patrons evolved as cities saw themselves reflected in his disciplined leadership. The earliest chronicles describing conflicts often emphasized the righteousness of the victorious city. Victories were attributed to the favor of the gods. Losses were explained through divine displeasure or the mistakes of leaders. These interpretations reinforced the belief that strength required moral grounding. Shara's symbolism influenced this perspective. His disciplined development offered a standard for evaluating actions. Victory aligned with responsibility. Recklessness brought consequences. Myth and reality intertwined to shape how communities interpreted the cost of conflict. The development of law codes also reflected the growing complexity of strength. Leaders recognized that stability depended not only on physical defense but on social order. Laws were written to define acceptable behavior, regulate trade, and resolve disputes. These laws reduced internal tension and helped preserve unity. Mythic narratives echoed this focus on order. Stories depicted divine assemblies establishing guidelines for behaviour. Shara's role in maintaining structure aligned with these developments. His portrayal reinforced the connection between discipline and justice. As time passed, the cumulative weight of these developments became part of the city's histories. Ruins unearthed today show both the glory and fragility of early civilizations. Massive walls, temple foundations, and administrative tablets reveal the extent of human achievement. At the same time, layers of ash, erosion, and collapsed structures hint at the challenges they faced. These archaeological traces reflect the dual nature of strength. It allowed cities to flourish, but it also demanded resources and decisions that carried consequences. Shara's story became one of the ways ancient people made sense of this duality. The presence of strength in daily life shaped cultural identity. Festivals celebrated the accomplishments of the gods in the city. Processions reminded communities of their unity. Military victories were recorded, but so were the hardships endured. People understood that their survival depended on shared effort. Mythology captured this understanding. Shara's disciplined character became a symbol of collective responsibility. His steady development offered reassurance that even in times of tension, order could be maintained. As cities continued to rise and fall, the concept of strength evolved. Some cities expanded rapidly, only to collapse under external pressure or internal strife. Others remained small but stable. These variations reflected the unpredictable nature of human society. Mythic narratives, though rooted in symbolic interpretation, helped communities navigate this uncertainty. Shara's story provided a model for responding to change. His calm readiness suggested that strength needed constant attention. The price of strength became clearer with each passing century. Cities that invested heavily in defense sometimes neglected internal unity. Those that ignored external threats risked collapse. Leaders who acted impulsively brought ruin. Leaders who hesitated too long brought instability. Myths offered guidance by showing that divine figures also faced decisions with heavy consequences. Shara's disciplined presence reinforced the idea that measured action was essential. The gradual emergence of empires further changed the meaning of strength. When larger political structures formed, they required even greater organization. Armies grew, administration expanded, diplomacy became essential. Myths evolved again, reflecting broader political realities. Shara's role in these stories remained grounded in discipline, even as new gods took on roles associated with sovereignty or expansion. His steady presence continued shaping the way societies understood conflict. The dust and glory of early civilizations reflected both triumph and vulnerability. Cities produced art, writing, architecture, and systems of governance that influenced the world for thousands of years. They also faced collapse, invasion, and disaster. The myths they left behind preserved their values. Shara's development became part of that legacy. His journey from quiet divine child to disciplined figure-guiding strength symbolized the path cities traveled. His measured approach captured the lessons people learned about the cost of maintaining stability. As these cities continued searching for ways to endure, they relied on stories that helped them understand their place in the world. Shara's presence provided a framework for interpreting strength not as a source of pride alone, but as a responsibility shared by everyone within the walls. His story became a reminder that order required constant care, that leadership required discipline, and that communities survived when they understood how to balance ambition with caution. The cities that rose from dust and reached toward glory left a legacy shaped by both their accomplishments and their challenges. Their stories continue to echo through the myths that guided them. And through those myths, Shara's steady influence remained part of how early civilizations understood the price of strength as they moved forward toward a world growing more complex with each generation. Exploring the burdens carried by the earliest warriors requires moving into a world where myth and daily life blended so closely that they shaped each other without distinction. The people of early Mesopotamia lived in societies where survival depended on the decisions of individuals who stood at the boundary between danger and safety. Those who took on this role learned quickly that their responsibilities extended far beyond the physical demands of combat. They carried expectations set by their communities, their leaders, and the gods they believed oversaw the structure of the world. As myths developed, they began to describe warriors not as figures who wielded strength freely, but as individuals who bore the weight of maintaining order. Shara's evolution into a figure associated with disciplined conflict contributed significantly to this understanding. In the earlier stages of warrior culture, strength alone was not enough. Communities needed individuals capable of making difficult choices under pressure. They needed people who could put aside personal desires and act on behalf of others. These responsibilities formed the core of what eventually became known as honor. Honor was not a prize or decoration. It was a standard. It dictated how warriors behaved when no one was watching, and how they responded when circumstances demanded sacrifice. Myths began tying honor closely to divine will, suggesting that the gods expected warriors to uphold values that preserved stability. Shara's steady presence in these narratives helped define the qualities associated with honor. His early development emphasized patience and discipline. He learned before he acted. He listened before he spoke. These traits became essential to the mythic concept of the honorable warrior. Stories suggested that true strength did not involve aggression but restraint. Warriors who followed Shara's example were expected to consider the consequences of their decisions. They were seen as protectors rather than enforcers. Honor grew from understanding one's role within a larger structure. Alongside honor, obedience became a central theme in the myths describing warriors. Obedience did not imply blind submission. It meant recognizing the authority of leaders and understanding the importance of unity. In early cities, leaders depended on the loyalty of those responsible for defense. Warriors needed to trust commands during moments of tension. They needed clarity, not improvisation. Mythological narratives reinforced this need by depicting divine hierarchies that mirrored human leadership structures. Gods held defined roles. Their actions followed patterns that reflected the order of the world. Shara's discipline development supported this framework. His loyalty to higher divine figures demonstrated the value of obedience rooted in purpose. The concept of divine command in these stories did not involve constant intervention. The gods were not imagined as issuing instructions for every action. Instead, divine command functioned as a moral foundation. It provided guidance on how to interpret situations that required strength. When myths described gods placing warriors under their protection or authority, they implied that the warrior's actions needed to align with divine expectations. This connection offered reassurance that difficult decisions carried legitimacy. It also imposed a standard of accountability. Warriors who acted irresponsibly risked not only social disapproval, but divine disfavor. The relationship between honor, obedience, and divine command shaped the everyday experience of warrior culture. Warriors occupied a position of high responsibility. They were expected to protect their communities while avoiding unnecessary conflict. They needed to show courage while also demonstrating discipline. These expectations made the warrior's role both respected and heavy. The burden lay not in the physical act of conflict, but in the moral implications of each action taken. Myths captured this complexity by portraying warriors as individuals whose actions influence both the human world and the divine. Shara emerged as a symbolic figure who embodied the balance required for this role. He represented strength shaped by understanding. He stood ready without seeking conflict. His association with weapons carried meaning because the weapons symbolized responsibility. Stories describing his march or his participation in divine assemblies reflected the importance of measured action. Warriors who aligned themselves with his values internalized the belief that strength must serve the community. As warfare became more structured, myths expanded to show how divine expectations shaped the behavior of entire armies. Leaders invoke the names of gods before undertaking significant actions. Warriors participated in rituals meant to reinforce their loyalty. These ceremonies connected them to divine order. They reminded participants that their responsibilities extended beyond personal ambition. Shara's role in these rituals often reflected his disciplined nature. His presence helped guide warriors toward a mindset that valued patience, clarity, and unity. The idea of the warrior's burden also appeared in stories describing individuals who failed to uphold these values. Myths sometimes warned against the consequences of reckless behavior. These narratives illustrated how a single act of impulsive strength could bring harm to a community. They emphasized that warriors carried responsibilities that required constant awareness. The inclusion of such warnings reinforced the belief that the burden of strength involved continuous effort. Shara's symbolic presence in these stories served as a reminder of the discipline needed to avoid such mistakes. Another layer of the warrior's burden involved the expectations placed on leaders who guided those responsible for maintaining stability. Leaders had to balance compassion with decisiveness. They had to interpret divine signs, manage resources, and maintain unity. Their actions set standards for others. Myths depicted divine leaders navigating similar challenges. These portrayals gave human leaders models for how to approach difficult decisions. Shara's role as a figure who learned through observation and grew into leadership with deliberate intention made him a valuable example. He demonstrated that leadership required both strength and humility. The weight of honor, obedience, and divine command also shaped the social identity of warriors. They were not isolated individuals. They belonged to groups that trained together, shared responsibilities, and relied on each other for protection. Their actions affected everyone around them. This interdependence formed a significant part of the warrior's burden. Myths reflected this by describing divine figures acting as groups when maintaining order. Shara's participation in divine processions illustrated the importance of unity. His steady march showed that leadership required guiding others calmly. Rituals performed before conflict further reinforced the concept of the warrior's burden. These rituals were not meant to glorify violence. They were meant to ensure that actions aligned with divine expectations. Offerings were made to gods associated with stability. Priests recited prayers that reminded warriors of the values they represented. These practices emphasized accountability. They reminded participants that strength served a purpose beyond personal desire. Shara's values played a role in shaping these expectations. His disciplined approach helped communities articulate the moral framework surrounding conflict. The warrior's burden also involved an emotional dimension. Warriors carried fear, uncertainty, and the knowledge that their actions could alter the lives of those they protected. Myths acknowledged these emotions indirectly through the portrayal of divine figures facing difficult decisions. Shara's calm readiness suggested that even divine beings understood the weight of responsibility. His controlled presence offered reassurance that caution and clarity were valuable qualities in moments of tension. As the political landscape of Mesopotamia shifted and early city-states began interacting more frequently, the warrior's burden expanded. Conflicts between cities required coordinated action. Alliances required trust. Decisions carried consequences that extended beyond local boundaries. Myths adapted to reflect these complexities. Divine assemblies became more prominent in storytelling. They depicted gods discussing responsibilities, evaluating tensions, and assigning duties. Shara's presence in these assemblies reinforced his role as a disciplined figure who understood the importance of structure. The burden carried by warriors reflected the ideals that early civilizations valued. Strength was not meant to be used freely. It had to be restrained. It had to be justified. It had to reflect values that preserved community stability. Myths reinforced these principles through the stories of divine figures. Shara's evolution played an important role in shaping the narrative of the responsible warrior. His development showed that strength required preparation. It showed that obedience could coexist with independence when guided by purpose. It showed that honor involved understanding consequences. Over time, the myths portraying warriors and divine guidance influenced each other. As societies became more structured, myths emphasized the need for discipline. As myths emphasized discipline, societies reinforced it through rituals, training, and leadership expectations. This feedback loop shaped the identity of warriors and the cultural meaning of strength. The warrior's burden also extended beyond moments of conflict. Warriors were expected to maintain peace. They acted as guardians, mediators, and symbols of authority. Their presence deterred threats and reassured communities. These roles required discipline and understanding. Myths reinforced the broader responsibilities of warriors by showing divine figures engaged in acts that maintained order. Shara's calm presence in these narratives reminded communities that strength must be continuous, not reactive. As warrior culture evolved, the influence of divine command became more nuanced. Leaders claimed divine support for their decisions, but myths reminded them that divine approval required adherence to moral principles. Stories of gods punishing recklessness or rewarding discipline reinforced the idea that divine command involved accountability. Warriors internalized this belief. They understood that their actions held spiritual as well as social implications. Shara's example helped articulate the values expected of those who carried weapons and acted under divine authority. The relationship between warriors and the divine remained central to early civilization. It shaped political systems, social structures, and cultural identity. Myths helped communities interpret the burdens placed on those responsible for maintaining stability. Shara's disciplined development became part of this interpretive framework. His steady presence offered reassurance that the weight of strength could be managed with clarity and purpose. As conflicts grew more complex and societies continued to expand, the warrior's burden remained a defining feature of human experience. Myths evolved, but the core values persisted. Strength required responsibility. Honor required understanding. Obedience required respect for both leadership and the divine order. These principles continued shaping the identity of warriors and the expectations placed upon them. Through the stories passed from generation to generation, Shara's influence continued guiding the interpretation of these burdens. His calm, deliberate approach to strength provided a model for how individuals and communities could navigate tension. His values helped shape the understanding that maintaining order required effort. His presence reinforced the belief that warriors carried responsibilities that extended beyond the battlefield. The warrior's burden was never simple. It required constant vigilance, careful thought, and an awareness of consequences. Mythology helped articulate these demands. Shara's story offered a steady reminder that true strength came from discipline, that honor involved more than recognition, and that obedience reflected commitment to a greater purpose. As societies continued evolving, these lessons remained part of how communities understood the responsibilities tied to wielding strength in a world shaped by both human decision and divine guidance. As the centuries passed and early cities matured into more complex societies, Shara's presence became woven into the daily rhythm of life in ways that reflected the evolving needs of the people who lived under the watchful gaze of their gods. His story was not confined to a single temple or region. Instead, it moved fluidly through the hands of priests, the ambitions of kings, and the duties of soldiers. Each group interpreted him according to the responsibilities they carried. These interpretations shaped rituals, policies, and traditions that reinforced his identity as a disciplined figure capable of guiding societies through tension. The earliest evidence of Shara's cult appears in the city of Umma, where inscriptions hint at his role as a protective deity connected to leadership and order. Temples dedicated to him were not as large as those built for the great gods, but they held significant influence within the communities that honoured his values. Priests serving in these temples played an important role in shaping how Shara was understood. They were responsible for preserving hymns, performing rituals, and advising leaders on matters interpreted through divine guidance. Their interpretations of Shara emphasized responsibility, discipline, and readiness, reflecting both mythic tradition and the practical challenges faced by their communities. Priests in ancient Mesopotamia carried authority that extended beyond ritual practice. They acted as scholars, administrators, and interpreters of omens. Their understanding of Shara emerged from both textual tradition and observed social needs. When they spoke of him, they described a figure whose calm presence provided a model for how strength should be maintained. They emphasized his disciplined nature, portraying him as a guide for those entrusted with protecting the city. In their hymns, Shara was often described as standing ready beside the divine assembly. This portrayal reinforced the belief that readiness was a sacred quality, not merely a practical necessity. The role of priests in shaping Shara's cult extended into daily civic life. Temples functioned as centers of both religious and administrative activity. Priests recorded transactions, monitored agricultural cycles, and advised on matters involving resource distribution. When conflict emerged, whether internal disputes or external tensions, their interpretation of divine will mattered deeply. Shara's disciplined identity guided their recommendations. His values influenced how they encouraged leaders to act. They promoted patience, structured decision-making, and the careful weighing of consequences. These teachings aligned with the broader responsibilities of early cities striving for stability. Kings found meaning in Shara's values as well. Kingship carried extraordinary weight in early Mesopotamia. A king was expected to protect, provide, and maintain order. His legitimacy depended on demonstrating alignment with the gods. This relationship between kings and divine figures shaped the rituals performed at coronations, festivals, and diplomatic events. Kings invoked the gods to affirm their authority, and they acknowledged the gods to justify their decisions. Shara, with his steady, disciplined image, became a symbol many kings embraced to reinforce their identity as responsible leaders. Kings often sought the support of deities associated with protection and order. They needed a narrative that connected their actions to divine expectations. Shara's mythology offered such a narrative. He was not a figure of chaotic strength. He embodied the values kings needed to demonstrate: control, readiness, loyalty, and measured judgment. This alignment made his cult appealing to rulers who wanted to emphasize their commitment to preserving stability. Temples dedicated to Shara received royal patronage, and ceremonial offerings became ways for kings to express devotion and reinforce their legitimacy. The connection between kings and Shara also reflected the political realities of the time. As city-states competed for resources and influence, kings needed to balance diplomacy with defense. Their decisions affected entire populations. They needed divine symbols that reassured their people during uncertainty. Shara's association with organized strength provided this reassurance. His story demonstrated that disciplined action aligned with divine order. Kings used this symbolism to justify their strategies. They portrayed themselves as leaders following the example of a god who stood ready to guide and protect. Soldiers also found meaning in Shara's story. Their responsibilities extended beyond the battlefield. They guarded city gates, patrolled boundaries, and ensured the safety of trade routes. Their presence contributed to the stability of the community. These duties demanded discipline, loyalty, and an understanding of the broader consequences of their actions. Shara's development into a figure symbolic of structured strength provided a template for how soldiers viewed their roles. He embodied the principles that shaped military conduct. Rituals involving soldiers often took place in or near temples dedicated to protective gods. These rituals reinforced expectations surrounding honor, obedience, and responsibility. Offerings were made before campaigns or missions. Prayers emphasized the values soldiers were meant to uphold. Shara's presence shaped these rituals. His identity served as a reminder that strength required restraint. His values encouraged soldiers to act with clarity and discipline. These rituals reinforced the belief that soldiers acted not for personal gain, but for the benefit of the community. The relationship between Shara and soldiers extended into symbolic practices. Symbols associated with him, such as banners, spears, or shields, were incorporated into military ceremonies or training traditions. These objects carried meaning beyond their practical use. They represented standards soldiers were expected to meet. Carrying a banner that symbolized Shara meant committing oneself to disciplined conduct. Holding a spear associated with him reminded warriors that their role involved protection, not reckless aggression. Priests, kings, and soldiers shaped Shara's cult in different ways, but their interpretations shared common themes. They emphasized discipline, readiness, and responsibility. These values resonated through every aspect of early Mesopotamian society. They influenced decision-making, ritual practice, and political identity. Shara's myth provided a language for understanding the demands placed upon those responsible for maintaining order. The growth of Shara's cult did not occur uniformly. His significance varied across regions and time periods. Some cities elevated him above other protective deities, while others integrated his values into broader religious systems. This variability reflects the diversity of early Mesopotamian culture. Each community adapted Shara's story to its unique circumstances. Yet despite these differences, the core values associated with him remained consistent. The influence of Shara's cult also extended into how communities interpreted omens. Omens played a crucial role in early decision-making. Priests interpreted signs in the stars, the behavior of animals, and the patterns of weather. These interpretations offered guidance on when to act and when to wait. Shara's disciplined nature influenced how omens related to conflict were understood. If signs suggested danger, priests invoking Shara emphasized preparation. If signs indicated caution, they encouraged restraint. His influence shaped the balance between action and patience. Kings often consulted priests before undertaking major decisions. These consultations reinforced the connection between divine guidance and political action. When priests invoked Shara, they highlighted values that encouraged stability. They reminded kings that strength required responsibility. They warned against impulsive decisions that could bring harm to the community. Kings who aligned their actions with these teachings strengthened their legitimacy. They presented themselves as leaders guided by disciplined divine principles. Soldiers, meanwhile, internalized Shara's values as part of their training. They learned that their actions reflected the identity of the city. They learned that personal ambition could not outweigh communal responsibility. These teachings shaped their conduct. Soldiers who respected divine principles were considered honorable. Those who acted recklessly risked divine disapproval. Myths reinforced this understanding. Stories of divine figures punishing arrogance or rewarding discipline served as reminders of the moral weight carried by every warrior. The cults dedicated to Shara also influenced community rituals beyond conflict-related events. Festivals celebrating the city's stability often included offerings to gods associated with protection. Shara's presence during these events symbolized gratitude for preserved order. Priests led hymns that praised his readiness. Kings offered gifts that demonstrated their commitment to maintaining balance. Soldiers participated in processions that reaffirmed their dedication to the community's protection. These rituals strengthened social cohesion. They reminded individuals that stability depended on shared effort. They reinforced the belief that strength, when aligned with divine values, contributed to the longevity of the city. Shara's role as a symbol of disciplined strength became essential to these expressions of unity. His story provided a framework through which communities could interpret their collective responsibilities. The evolution of Shara's cult also reflected broader cultural changes. As cities expanded into larger political entities, religious practices became more formalized. Temples grew in size and complexity. Administrative systems connected religious and political institutions. Priests gained influence as intermediaries between kings and gods. Shara's disciplined nature made him a respected figure in this system. His values supported the bureaucratic structures necessary for maintaining large territories. At the same time, soldiers began forming more organized units. These units required training, hierarchy, and coordination. Their roles extended beyond defense. They participated in construction, transportation, and ceremonial duties. Shara's influence shaped their identity within this system. His association with discipline and readiness reinforced the importance of preparedness. His story helped define the qualities expected of those who served. As Shara's cult spread through different layers of society, his influence helped shape the way communities understood leadership. Leaders who aligned themselves with his values demonstrated a commitment to stability. They presented themselves as protectors guided by disciplined principles. This connection influenced how communities evaluated their rulers. A king who upheld Shara's values earned trust. A king who ignored them risked unrest. Priests, kings, and soldiers formed the foundation of Shara's cult, but ordinary citizens also participated. They prayed for protection during uncertain times. They offered small tokens at temples. They recited hymns that invoked Shara's guidance. These practices reflected the belief that discipline mattered at every level of society. Shara's story reminded individuals that maintaining order required both collective effort and individual responsibility. The cults that remembered Shara kept his values alive through changing eras. Different generations reinterpreted his story according to their circumstances, yet his core identity remained steady. He continued to symbolize disciplined strength and quiet readiness. His influence extended across political shifts, economic changes, and cultural variations. His story persisted because it addressed universal concerns: how to maintain stability, how to balance strength with responsibility, and how to navigate tension without sacrificing order. As societies continued to evolve, the symbolic meaning of Shara's presence remained relevant. His role in myth supported the structures that held communities together. His story provided continuity in a world shaped by both growth and uncertainty. Through priests, kings, and soldiers, Shara's influence endured, guiding the interpretation of strength and the responsibilities tied to it, as early civilizations continued their steady progression into new eras. Understanding how Shara appeared, disappeared, and reappeared in the historical record requires moving through several layers of interpretation, shaped by time, culture, and the gradual decay of memory. The earliest Mesopotamian gods entered the modern world through fragments of tablets, scattered references in royal inscriptions, and the remnants of rituals that endured only because later generations reshaped them. Shara's presence in these sources is subtle. It exists more as a texture than a fixed image. Scholars learned to recognize him not through a clear narrative, but through patterns that linked discipline, protection, and leadership in unexpected ways. The absence of dramatic stories made him difficult to categorize. Yet this very ambiguity drew the attention of researchers who recognized that figures without overwhelming mythic footprints often reveal more about everyday life than those who dominate epic tales. As academic interest in Mesopotamian religion grew during the 19th and 20th centuries, scholars began piecing together the roles of lesser-known deities. Their work leaned heavily on archaeology, philology, and comparisons across cities and time periods. The tablets they studied came from temple archives, administrative records, legal documents, and hymns. Shara's name appeared in different contexts that hinted at multiple interpretations. Some texts linked him to Umma, one of the prominent early city-states. Others portrayed him as connected to Inanna, reflecting the complex web of divine relationships that shaped Mesopotamian theology. These scattered references made it clear that Shara occupied a position that mattered, yet resisted simple categorization. One of the first challenges scholars faced involved distinguishing Shara from other divine figures associated with strength. Mesopotamian mythology included many gods who wielded authority over conflict, protection, or enforcement. These roles often overlapped. Their identities sometimes shifted depending on the city or political climate. Shara appeared as a disciplined figure who represented readiness, yet he lacked the dramatic narratives common to gods like Ninurta or Nergal. This led some researchers to view him as a localized deity whose influence never extended far beyond specific regions. Others believed his subtle presence reflected a type of divine figure whose importance lay in symbolism rather than story. This ambiguity encouraged debate. Some scholars argue that Shara's significance had been overstated by early researchers eager to categorize every deity. They suggested that his presence in administrative texts indicated a cult that functioned primarily as a civic tradition rather than a deeply spiritual one. They pointed to the absence of detailed myths and the limited archaeological evidence of widespread devotion. From this perspective, Shara resembled many lesser deities who served narrow, functional roles within specific cities. Other scholars disagreed. They emphasized that the absence of dramatic myths did not diminish a deity's significance. They argued that Shara appeared in contexts tied to leadership, protection, and disciplined action, all of which were vital to early urban life. They suggested that his subtle presence reflected a cultural value rather than a narrative tradition. These researchers interpreted Shara as a symbolic figure whose qualities guided leaders and warriors. They believed that his influence extended through indirect means, shaping rituals and expectations even when he did not appear in elaborate tales. The debate deepened as more tablets were discovered. Some inscriptions mentioned offerings made to Shara during periods of tension or uncertainty. These offerings suggested that he played a role in guiding communal decision-making. Other texts linked him to ceremonial processions that displayed the unity of the city during festivals. These references suggested he had a role in reinforcing social order. Such evidence supported the view that Shara's significance stemmed from his embodiment of disciplined strength rather than dramatic acts. Skeptics remained cautious. They argued that interpretations of Shara risked becoming speculative due to the fragmentary nature of the evidence. They warned against projecting modern expectations onto ancient texts. According to their perspective, the best approach involved acknowledging the limits of the available material. They encouraged researchers to view Shara as an example of how incomplete records shaped modern understanding of ancient belief systems. Their caution reflected a broader challenge in reconstructing Mesopotamian religion, differentiating between absence of evidence and evidence of absence. Despite these debates, scholars continued exploring the ways Shara's presence appeared across different types of sources. Administrative records indicated that offerings were made to him alongside other protective deities. Hymns described him as a figure of readiness. Ritual texts suggested he participated symbolically in ceremonies related to leadership. These patterns pointed toward a consistent identity, even if the details varied across regions. Shara represented a disciplined form of strength, a quality valued in both divine and human contexts. The relationship between Shara and Inanna also attracted scholarly attention. Some texts described him as a guardian or attendant linked to her temple system. This connection puzzled researchers who noted that Inanna often embodied intense, unpredictable forces. Shara's steady, disciplined identity contrasted with her more dynamic nature. Some scholars interpreted this relationship as symbolic of the balance between order and intensity. They argued that pairing Shara with Inanna illustrated the need to stabilize powerful forces. Others viewed the connection as a reflection of political alliances between cities devoted to these deities. They suggested that Shara's cult gained influence through association with more prominent divine figures. Skeptics questioned both interpretations. They emphasized that the available references were too limited to draw firm conclusions. They argued that the connection between Shara and Inanna might reflect administrative relationships rather than theological meaning. They reminded researchers that temples often shared resources and personnel. The appearance of two deities' names in related contexts did not always indicate a mythological or symbolic association. Their caution highlighted the complexity of interpreting ancient religious systems. The role of soldiers in Shara's cult offered another avenue of study. Texts describing military training or boundary protection sometimes referenced offerings to protective deities. Shara's name appeared in several of these contexts. This suggested that his values aligned with the responsibilities of organized defense. Scholars studying early warfare recognized that the qualities associated with Shara, discipline, readiness, calm authority, matched the expectations placed upon those who protected city boundaries. These connections reinforced the idea that his cult played a role in shaping military identity. However, skeptics argued that this interpretation risked oversimplifying the evidence. They pointed out that many protective deities played roles in rituals linked to defense. The presence of Shara's name did not necessarily indicate a unique connection to military culture. They suggested that his appearance in such texts demonstrated local tradition rather than a broader theological significance. Their caution reflected an ongoing tension in scholarship, distinguishing between localized practices and widespread religious ideas. The study of Shara's cult also intersected with the analysis of political inscriptions. Kings often invoked the names of gods to legitimize their authority. Some inscriptions included references to Shara as a divine supporter of leadership. These references suggested that Shara represented values aligned with responsible governance. Scholars argued that rulers who emphasized discipline and stability would naturally seek association with a deity whose identity reflected these qualities. Such interpretations contributed to the view that Shara played a symbolic role in reinforcing political legitimacy. Yet again, skeptics urged restraint. They noted that kings often invoked multiple gods to reinforce their authority. The inclusion of Shara's name did not necessarily indicate deep devotion. It could have reflected traditional formulas or regional expectations. They warned against building extensive conclusions from limited references. Their perspective demonstrated the care required when interpreting ancient political symbolism. Over time, this debate shaped the way scholars approach Shara. Instead of seeking a definitive narrative, researchers began focusing on the patterns created by subtle references. They recognized that many deities in Mesopotamian religion had small but meaningful roles. These figures did not dominate myths, yet they influenced social identity and ritual practice. Shara fit this pattern. His presence in administrative records, ritual texts, and political inscriptions suggested a deity whose influence extended through cultural values rather than dramatic stories. This understanding also encouraged researchers to reconsider the significance of lesser-known deities. The focus on major gods had overshadowed the contributions of figures whose roles reflected daily life more closely than cosmic dramas. Shara's presence in rituals associated with leadership, protection, and discipline demonstrated how mythology permeated civic life. Scholars began approaching his story as an example of how values were transmitted through religious practice rather than epic narratives. As modern perspectives continued evolving, the interpretation of Shara became a reflection of broader academic trends. Some researchers viewed him as a cultural memory that preserved early ideas about discipline and strength. Others approached him as an administrative deity whose significance lay in ritual function rather than mythic identity. Still others considered him a symbolic figure who influenced warrior culture indirectly through values embraced by the community. Skeptics remained important in this process. Their insistence on cautious interpretation prevented speculative theories from overshadowing the evidence. They reminded scholars that ancient religious systems were complex and often regionally diverse. They encouraged recognition of the limits inherent in reconstructing belief systems from incomplete sources. Their approach helped ensure that modern interpretations remained grounded in verifiable material. The interplay between scholars and skeptics shaped the modern understanding of Shara's elusive identity. He became less a figure defined by specific stories and more a symbol representing the intersection of leadership, responsibility, and protection. His presence echoed through administrative texts, ritual archives, and military traditions. These echoes created a portrait of a deity whose influence extended across different layers of society, without relying on grand narratives. This subtlety allowed Shara to remain relevant within academic discussions. His story provided insight into how ancient communities understood the relationship between divine values and human responsibility. It demonstrated how myths shaped expectations for leaders, warriors, and citizens. It revealed how complex belief systems could develop without relying on dramatic tales. Shara's elusive shadow encouraged researchers to look beyond the obvious and explore the quieter aspects of ancient religion. As scholarship continued advancing, new discoveries occasionally added small pieces to Shara's puzzle. A tablet mentioning his name in an unexpected context, a ritual text describing offerings placed at a boundary marker, a hymnal fragment referring to his readiness. Each piece contributed to the mosaic of his identity, yet none of these discoveries provided a definitive answer. Instead, they reinforced the idea that Shara's significance lay not in what he did, but in what he represented. Through the work of scholars and the caution of skeptics, Shara's story evolved into a reflection of early civilization's struggle to articulate the meaning of strength, authority, and responsibility. His elusive presence illustrated how ancient communities interpreted their own challenges through divine symbolism. His shadow persisted across time not through dramatic myth, but through the steady influence of values that shaped daily life. As new interpretations emerged, Shara remained a reminder that some figures endure not because they dominate the stories of their age, but because they embody principles that societies cannot function without. His disciplined identity offered a lens through which scholars could examine the foundations of leadership and the expectations placed on those responsible for maintaining order in a world continually shaped by tension and transformation. Tracing the origins of human conflict often leads people through archaeological layers, historical documents, and the steady evolution of early society. But myth adds another dimension that helps explain how ancient people understood the forces shaping their lives. The stories told about gods such as Shara functioned as bridges between lived experience and cultural memory. They did not create human instincts, but they provided frameworks through which communities interpreted them. Understanding whether Shara shaped the human inclination toward conflict involves examining how mythology and memory interacted to form long-lasting ideas about responsibility, strength, and the complex nature of confrontation. When early humans began settling in permanent communities, they faced challenges that required negotiation, cooperation, and sometimes confrontation. Conflict emerged naturally, not because of divine instruction, but because people needed to navigate limited resources, shifting boundaries, and competing interests. These pressures existed long before myths were recorded. However, once communities developed writing and ritual structures, they began to encode these pressures into stories. They looked to the gods to help explain why conflict existed and how it should be managed. Shara's presence in these interpretations reflected the desire to shape conflict into something that could be understood, controlled, and guided rather than feared. Shara's story offered a model that framed conflict as a responsibility rather than an impulse. His steady development into a figure representing discipline and readiness suggested that conflict was not inherently chaotic. It required structure. It required measured action. These ideas influenced how communities interpreted their own instincts. They helped transform raw tension into organized behavior. Through myth, people came to understand conflict as something that needed guidance. Shara provided an example of how to approach these moments with restraint. The human instinct for conflict did not originate from mythology, yet myth influenced how that instinct was expressed. The portrayal of Shara as a disciplined figure helped shape cultural expectations surrounding confrontation. Individuals who lived within societies that valued order internalized these expectations. They learned that conflict carried weight and required accountability. By providing symbolic guidance, Shara helped communities articulate the difference between necessary conflict and destructive behavior. His story became a framework for interpreting decisions that carried social consequences. As early societies grew more complex, the need to manage conflict increased. Population growth placed pressure on resources. Trade expanded, bringing interactions with distant groups. Political structures developed, introducing systems for resolving disputes. These changes required new approaches to conflict. Myths adapted to reflect these pressures. Shara's presence in ritual and administrative contexts provided a symbolic model for leadership. His story offered reassurance that controlled strength aligned with divine expectations. Communities could rely on his example to justify their actions and understand their responsibilities. Memory also played a significant role in shaping the human instinct for conflict. As stories passed from one generation to another, they preserved cultural experiences of tension, cooperation, and survival. Myths about Shara included echoes of real conflicts faced by early communities. These echoes helped shape collective memory. They taught people that conflict had always existed but could be managed. They reinforced the belief that strength required discipline. Through memory, Shara's association with controlled conflict influenced how communities understood their own history. Archaeological evidence further demonstrates how myth and memory intertwined. Excavations of ancient cities reveal signs of conflict, burned layers, collapsed fortifications, mass graves. But they also reveal signs of order, planned streets, administrative tablets, carefully built temples. These traces reflect the dual nature of early civilization. Conflict existed, yet communities developed systems to manage it. Myth helped articulate the meaning behind these systems. Shara's disciplined identity provided a narrative for interpreting them. He embodied the belief that conflict should support stability rather than undermine it. Even when direct references to Shara are sparse, his influence appears in the structure of early Mesopotamian society. Rules governing conflict resolution, property boundaries, and social conduct all reflect the values associated with disciplined strength. These rules show that early societies recognized the importance of controlling conflict. They understood that unregulated aggression threatened their survival. By creating legal frameworks, they aligned their behavior with the values represented by mythic figures like Shara. His story provided a symbolic foundation for these systems. Scholars examining the relationship between myth and human behavior argue that stories like Shara's helped encode cultural expectations. These expectations influenced how individuals interpreted their instincts. Instead of responding impulsively, people learned to consider consequences. They recognized the importance of unity during periods of tension. They understood that conflict required purpose. Myth shaped these understandings not by dictating behavior, but by framing it within a larger narrative. The question of whether Shara shaped the human instinct for conflict becomes clearer when considering how myths influenced identity. Communities define themselves through shared stories. They use these stories to teach younger generations about responsibility. Legends involving divine figures provided examples of behavior that aligned with cultural ideals. Shara's steady nature reinforced the belief that strength needed guidance. His identity encouraged communities to value discipline. These cultural lessons shaped how individuals responded to tension. The transformation of conflict from instinct to institution reflected this influence. Early confrontations may have been spontaneous, driven by immediate survival needs. Over time, these confrontations evolved into structured events guided by rules and rituals. Warriors trained, leaders planned, communities prepared. These developments reflected both practical necessity and mythic influence. Shara's story provided a symbolic justification for the discipline required. His presence helped communities shape conflict into something manageable. Memory also played a role in reinforcing these values. Stories describing Shara's readiness, loyalty, and controlled strength persisted because they resonated with real experiences. Communities saw their struggles reflected in these myths. When they faced conflict, they drew upon cultural memory that framed confrontation as a responsibility. Shara's identity became part of that memory. His story reminded them that conflict needed purpose. It reminded them that strength needed restraint. These reminders shaped how they interpreted their own instincts. The evolution of rituals associated with conflict also reveals myth's influence. Before engaging in difficult actions, communities performed ceremonies to align their decisions with divine values. These ceremonies emphasized discipline and clarity. They encouraged participants to reflect on their responsibilities. Shara's symbolic presence in these rituals reinforced the belief that strength required deliberate intention. This ritual structure helped transform instinctive responses into controlled behavior. Myth shaped these practices by providing symbolic meaning. The connection between myth and conflict becomes even clearer when examining how early leaders approached decision-making. Leaders needed to justify their actions to their communities. They sought legitimacy through divine association. By invoking Shara, they aligned their decisions with values of discipline and responsibility. Their actions shaped cultural expectations. People learned to interpret conflict through the lens of these values. Myth provided moral structure. Memory preserved it. Together, they shaped behavior. In modern scholarship, some researchers argue that myths did more than reflect social values. They helped create them. They suggest that stories like Shara's taught people how to interpret their instincts. Conflict existed regardless of myth, but myth shaped how societies responded. It helped communities develop systems to manage tension. It encouraged them to value discipline. It taught them that strength carried consequences. From this perspective, Shara did not create the human instinct for conflict, but he influenced how that instinct was understood. Skeptics caution against overstating the influence of myth. They argue that material conditions, such as resource scarcity, environmental challenges, and political pressures, played a more significant role in shaping behavior. They acknowledge that myths reflect cultural values, but question whether they significantly altered instinctive responses. Their perspective highlights the distinction between symbolic interpretation and practical action. They stress that myths should be viewed as reflections, not causes. Despite these debates, the relationship between Shara and the human instinct for conflict remains an instructive example of how myth shapes cultural memory. His presence offered a model for disciplined strength. Communities internalized this model and applied it to their own experiences. They used his story to interpret the meaning of conflict. They relied on his values to justify decisions. Through this process, myth influenced behavior indirectly. It did not change instinct. It shaped interpretation. Memory preserved these interpretations. It passed them from generation to generation. Children grew up hearing tales of divine figures who acted with purpose. They learned that conflict carried responsibility. They learned that strength required thought. These lessons shaped the cultural identity of entire regions. Shara's story became part of this identity. His disciplined nature influenced how communities taught their young. His values preserved through memory shaped how societies understood themselves. The interplay between myth and memory also influenced how communities recorded their history. Inscriptions describing conflicts often framed events within divine context. Leaders wrote that God supported their actions. They described victories as results of divine favor. These inscriptions shaped collective memory. They reinforced the belief that conflict aligned with divine values when approached responsibly. Shara's disciplined identity played a subtle role in this shaping. His presence provided a model for interpreting historical events. Archaeological evidence demonstrates how deeply these interpretations influenced daily life. Temples dedicated to protective deities occupied central places in cities. Ritual tools symbolized divine oversight. City walls stood as reminders of the need for readiness. These physical structures reflected the values associated with Shara. They embodied the belief that conflict required discipline. They showed that myths shaped not only thought but also material reality. By shaping cultural memory, Shara's story influenced the long-term development of conflict in early civilizations. His presence encouraged communities to view conflict as something that required structure. His discipline helped define the moral expectations placed upon leaders and warriors. His values shaped rituals and legal traditions. Through these influences, myth contributed to the evolution of conflict from instinctive response to organized institution. Even when his name faded from common usage, the values associated with him remained embedded in cultural memory. Later civilizations inherited concepts of disciplined conflict, structured hierarchies, and responsible leadership. These concepts did not require direct reference to Shara. They existed because they had become part of the cultural fabric. His story helped establish frameworks that persisted long after his cult diminished. His shadow remained woven into ideas about strength. The influence of such myths becomes clearer when examining how later societies approach conflict. Many civilizations developed codes of honor, military traditions, and legal systems that emphasized discipline. These ideas did not originate from any single deity. They evolved across centuries, yet their roots trace back to the values embedded in early myths. Shara's disciplined identity formed part of this foundation. His story contributed subtly, shaping ideas about conflict through cultural memory. Myth did not determine human instinct, but it helped shape how instinct was managed. Memory preserved these interpretations. Together, they influenced how early civilizations understood conflict, order, and responsibility. Shara's presence, though subtle, provided a framework for understanding strength. His disciplined nature helped communities navigate the complexities of confrontation. His influence appeared not through dramatic actions, but through the steady interpretation of values. Through this process, Shara became part of the cultural conversation about conflict. His story offered guidance during uncertain times. His values influenced rituals, leadership, and expectations placed on warriors. His identity shaped memory. As societies expanded, they carried these interpretations with them. The human instinct for conflict remained, but myth and memory helped shape its expression. Shara stood within that intersection, a symbol of disciplined strength that guided early civilizations as they confronted the challenges of their changing world. When ancient religions faded and temples sank beneath the weight of time, many of their gods disappeared quietly. Their names drifted into fragments of tablets, their stories scattered across museum shelves, their meanings reconstructed by patient scholars reading impressions left in clay. Yet some figures continue to move beneath the surface of cultural memory long after their cults vanished. They survived not because their myths were loud, but because their values touched parts of human life that never disappeared. Shara is one of those figures. His presence remains subtle, but it lingers in the structure societies built, in the expectations placed on leaders, and in the steady discipline that shaped early understandings of strength. The survival of a god in cultural memory rarely depends on the grandeur of their myths. It depends on relevance. It depends on how deeply their attributes connect to the needs and instincts of human societies. Shara's story never relied on dramatic transformations or overwhelming displays of divine power. His significance came from the quiet, patient development of values that early civilizations depended on for stability. These values did not fade with the fall of city-states. They became part of the foundation upon which later cultures built their own systems. In this way, Shara continued walking through history even as his temples crumbled. The earliest echoes of Shara's lingering presence can be seen in how societies continued interpreting strength long after Mesopotamian religion declined. Disciplined conflict remained a central theme of social organization. Leaders were expected to understand tension without being controlled by it. Soldiers were trained not only to fight, but to uphold codes that reinforced unity. These ideas did not originate from Shara alone, but his story represented an early articulation of them. The values associated with him became part of the wider cultural memory that shaped how strength was understood. As empire followed empire in the Near Eastern world, each new political system developed its own interpretations of authority. Yet the belief that strength required discipline, responsibility, and structure persisted. These expectations appeared in legal codes, military traditions, and civic rituals. Even when new gods replaced the old ones, the values preserved within earlier myths remained embedded within culture. Shara's influence existed within this continuity. His disciplined identity helped establish a framework for understanding leadership in a world where stability depended on carefully controlled power. The continuation of these values can also be seen in how societies recorded their histories. Ancient kings described themselves as shepherds of their people, protectors of order and guardians of boundaries. These descriptions reflected a broader cultural understanding of leadership that transcended individual deities. Yet the qualities they praised mirrored the values associated with Shara. He represented controlled strength rather than impulsive action. His steady presence in earlier myths offered a model for how authority could be exercised. Later rulers adopted similar language, even when they no longer invoked his name. Archaeological discoveries further reveal how the echoes of these values endured. Tablets describing early conflicts emphasized restraint and justification. Even ancient victories were framed within moral contexts. Leaders claimed that their actions aligned with divine expectations. They portrayed conflict as a last resort. This framing reflected a cultural memory shaped by myths that valued discipline. Shara's story contributed to that memory. His identity as a figure associated with readiness and responsibility influenced how communities preserved the meaning of conflict. The transformation of warrior culture also shows traces of Shara's continued influence. Early warriors were expected to serve their communities with loyalty, humility, and clarity. They were trained to recognize that their actions carried consequences for entire cities. These expectations persisted even as military structures evolved. Later cultures introduced codes of conduct, ethical guidelines, and structured hierarchies. These systems formalized ideas that had existed for centuries. Shara's presence in early mythology helped express these values during the earlier stages of their development. Even without direct reference, the ideas he embodied remained visible. The connection between Shara and cultural memory becomes clearer when examining how societies explain the relationship between conflict and order. Many ancient cultures believed that conflict, when controlled, protected stability. This belief shaped their political institutions and military strategies. It also influenced their rituals. Ceremonies performed before acts of defense emphasized calm intention. Leaders prayed not for victory alone, but for wisdom. These rituals echoed values associated with Shara. His quiet readiness appeared in the way communities approached decisions involving strength. Myth influenced these practices indirectly. It provided symbolic narratives that helped communities understand why certain behaviors mattered. Shara's disciplined identity shaped interpretations of conflict in ways that extended far beyond his cult. His story reflected the belief that strength had to be guided by responsibility. Cultural memory preserved that belief even when his name faded from collective awareness. The endurance of these values becomes even more visible when examining later philosophical traditions. Many ancient thinkers discussed the concept of controlled strength. They argued that restraint demonstrated true power. They believed that authority required discipline. These ideas appeared in political writings, ethical codes, and educational systems. Although these traditions drew from diverse influences, they reflected a continuity of thought that began in the earliest civilizations. Shara's story offered one of the earliest mythic expressions of this continuity. Modern interpretations of leadership also reflect these ideas. Societies often value calm decision-making, steady guidance, and the ability to manage conflict without escalation. These expectations mirror the disciplined leadership described in ancient myths. People still recognize that strength without control leads to instability. The emphasis on structure, restraint, and clarity echoes the values that ancient communities associated with Shara. Even though the mythic framework no longer guides these beliefs, the underlying principles remain. The echoes of Shara's identity also appear in how people interpret historical events. When historians describe leaders who manage conflict responsibly, they highlight qualities similar to those embedded in ancient myths. They emphasize discipline, preparation, and balanced decision-making. These descriptions reflect cultural expectations shaped by centuries of memory. Shara's values contributed indirectly to these expectations. His story captured a version of leadership that aligned with the needs of early urban life. Later generations inherited versions of these expectations even without knowing where they originated. Literary traditions also carried echoes of these mythic ideas. As storytelling evolved, many narratives depicted warriors who struggled with the burden of responsibility. Heroes were expected to act with wisdom and caution. Their success depended not on strength alone, but on understanding when and how to apply it. This narrative structure paralleled the values expressed through Shara's story. His identity offered a foundation upon which later storytelling traditions built their understanding of the responsible warrior. Even modern symbols of authority reflect patterns established in early mythology. Banners, uniforms, ceremonial processions, and oaths of service all carry meaning shaped by ancient ideas. These symbols represent unity, discipline, and readiness. They remind participants of the responsibilities tied to their roles. Shara carried a banner not as a sign of conquest, but as a symbol of purpose. That symbolism persists within institutions that emphasize order and responsibility. Shara's influence can also be seen in how societies interpret the emotional burden of conflict. Ancient myths acknowledged that strength carried weight. They recognized that warriors experienced fear, uncertainty, and moral responsibility. Shara's steady presence suggested a way to navigate these burdens. He represented calm guidance rather than overwhelming dominance. This interpretation influenced how communities supported those responsible for maintaining stability. They created rituals that encouraged reflection. They established systems that promoted unity. They recognized that conflict required more than physical strength. These ideas persisted across cultures and centuries. As cultural memory continued evolving, Shara's identity shifted from a specific deity to a symbol of values that societies needed. His presence became an echo carried through traditions rather than a central figure in religion. People no longer worshipped him directly, but the ideas he represented shaped how they interpreted conflict and leadership. Even when new religions emerged, these values continued influencing social structures. They became part of the background of cultural thought. This transformation is common in mythic history. Deities often fade as religious systems change, yet their symbolic contributions remain embedded in cultural memory. They shape expectations, values, and interpretations long after their names are forgotten. Shara's story demonstrates how this process works. His identity as a disciplined figure of controlled strength influenced early civilizations. Those influences persisted, carried through institutions, traditions, and moral frameworks. His presence remained not through worship, but through continuity of thought. The echo of his story becomes especially clear when examining how modern societies understand the balance between conflict and order. People recognize that conflict cannot be eliminated, but must be managed. They understand that authority requires responsibility. They believe that strength must be shaped by discipline. These ideas mirror the values associated with Shara. His identity offered one of the earliest articulations of this balance in human history. As scholars continue uncovering tablets and inscriptions, the details of Shara's story may expand. But even without new discoveries, his presence remains significant. He represents a type of divine figure whose influence does not rely on grand myths. Instead, it rests on values that societies adopted because they were essential for survival. His quiet echo persists through the systems people created, the expectations they formed, and the ways they interpreted conflict. Shara still walks through history not as a god commanding worship, but as a reflection of the enduring need for disciplined strength. Early civilizations recognized that stability depended on the ability to manage tension. They created stories that helped them understand this need. Shara's story formed part of that understanding. Through cultural memory, his values remained relevant across generations. His presence endures as a reminder of how ancient ideas continue shaping the world long after the temples that honoured them have turned to dust.